Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we venture into one of the most unforgiving places on Earth, where death stalks every step, and no rescue is guaranteed. 10 souls thought they were conquering the ultimate challenge when they set foot on Denali, North America's highest peak. What they found instead was a frozen hell that transforms ordinary expeditions into nightmarish battles against forces far beyond human comprehension. These are not tales of triumphant conquest, but harrowing accounts of real people who discovered that some mountains do not just test your limits, they shatter them completely. From experienced climbers who vanished without explanation to guides harboring deadly secrets, these stories will reveal why Denali remains one of the most feared and lethal peaks in the world. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Alaskan wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. Dion Mitchell had dreamed of conquering Denali since he was 12 years old, staring at photographs of the towering Alaskan peak in his father's mountaineering magazines. By the summer of 1967, at 24 years old, he had finally saved enough money to join Joe Wilcox's expedition to North America's highest summit. What should have been the adventure of a lifetime would instead become the deadliest disaster in Denali's recorded history, claiming 7 lives in what meteorologists would later call the worst storm to hit the mountain in over a century. The Wilcox expedition was a patchwork group of 12 climbers from across the United States, ranging in age from 22 to 31. Most had answered Wilcox's newsletter advertisements, drawn by the relatively affordable $300 fee that covered food and gear expenses. Dion, an engineering student from Colorado, had extensive experience on peaks throughout the Rockies, but like most of his teammates, he had never climbed above 15,000 feet. Denali's summit towered at 20,810 feet, presenting an entirely different level of challenge than anything the group had previously attempted. The National Park Service had initially expressed skepticism about the expedition's application, citing the team's collective inexperience with high-altitude mountaineering. Park rangers recommended that Wilcox's group merge with a more seasoned Colorado team led by Howard Snyder, who planned to attempt the summit during the same time frame. When a last-minute injury reduced Snyder's team below the mandatory 4-person minimum, the merger became necessary. The combined 12-man expedition would approach Denali via the remote Muldrow Glacier route on the mountain's north side, a less expensive but far more isolated path than the commonly used West Buttress route. On June 22nd, the team began their ascent, immediately encountering the brutal realities of high-altitude climbing. Most members suffered varying degrees of altitude sickness as they established a series of camps up the mountain's treacherous slopes. Despite these challenges, the expedition made steady progress through late June and into July. By July 13th, they had established a camp at 15,000 feet, positioning themselves for the final push to the summit. Weather reports indicated clear conditions for the next several days, though some accounts suggest park rangers may have warned of a developing storm system projected to hit the mountain around July 16th or 17th. The summit attempt began on July 15th, when 4 members of the team set out from the high camp at 18,000 feet. Joe Wilcox, Howard Snyder, Jerry Lewis, and Paul Schlichter made excellent time despite occasional stops to accommodate Lewis, who was struggling with the altitude. They reached Denali's summit at approximately 6:30 in the evening, encountering near-perfect conditions with exceptional visibility, minimal wind, and temperatures around 6 degrees Fahrenheit. After spending roughly an hour and a half at the top of North America, the group began their descent, returning to the high camp just before 10 that evening. The next day brought violent winds exceeding 70 miles per hour, forcing all 12 team members to remain huddled in their tents at the high camp. The mountain seemed to be warning them of what was to come. On July 17th, the wind subsided enough for the team to prepare their next moves. 7 members of the expedition would attempt the summit that day, while the 4 who had already reached the top would descend to the 15,000-foot camp. Dayon was among the summit group, led by Jerry Clark, an experienced climber who had participated in Antarctic expeditions. The descent team, which included Wilcox, Snyder, Lewis, and Schlichter, along with Anshel Schiff, who chose to forgo the summit due to worsening altitude sickness, began their journey down at approximately 1 in the afternoon. From their vantage point during the descent, they could see the high camp above them and were surprised to observe that Clark's summit team had not yet departed. Instead, the 7 climbers appeared to be organizing gear, searching for buried supplies, and making final preparations. Experienced mountaineers knew that good weather on Denali was precious and fleeting, not to be wasted on camp maintenance. Clark's team finally left for the summit around 3 in the afternoon, an alarmingly late start that would put them on the upper slopes well into the evening hours. Steve Taylor, suffering from severe altitude sickness, made the decision to remain at the high camp rather than risk the summit attempt. This meant 6 men were now climbing toward the top, while 1 stayed behind in an increasingly isolated position. At 8:30 that evening, Clark's voice crackled over the radio to rangers at the Eielson Visitor Center. The transmission carried an undertone of concern that would prove prophetic. Clark reported that the team was high on the mountain, but had become disoriented in dense fog that had suddenly enveloped the upper slopes. Visibility was essentially zero, making navigation impossible and forcing the group to bivouac wherever they found themselves. They had minimal food, few sleeping bags, and no tents, having planned for a rapid ascent and descent. The night would test their survival skills in ways they had never imagined. The following morning, July 18th, brought Clark's second and final radio transmission from the mountain's upper reaches. At 11:30, he contacted the visitor center with an update that was both triumphant and ominous. 5 members of the team had successfully reached Denali's summit. Clark himself, along with Dennis Lugterhand, Henry Janes, Mark McLaughlin, and Walt Taylor. Dion was among this group, finally achieving the dream that had driven him to Alaska. However, John Russell was unaccounted for, presumably having turned back during the climb in deteriorating conditions. Clark's voice conveyed the brutal reality of their situation as he described 7-degree temperatures, powerful winds, and complete whiteout conditions at the summit. The team planned to begin their descent within 5 to 10 minutes of the radio call and promised to check in again at 8 Warren that evening after returning to the high camp. Those would be the last words ever heard from any member of Clark's summit team. As the 7 men signed off from the summit on July 18th, one of the most catastrophic weather events in Denali's recorded history was already beginning to develop. A massive low-pressure system from the north, carrying enormous amounts of moisture and humidity, was colliding with the high-pressure area that had dominated the region. This meteorological collision would create a storm directly over the mountain, with unprecedented intensity and duration. Initial estimates placed wind speeds between 100 and 150 miles per hour, but later analysis by the National Weather Service revealed the true horror of what Clark's team faced. Advanced computer models indicated that winds near the summit likely reached nearly 300 miles per hour, creating conditions that no human being could survive. Temperatures plummeted to 15 to 30 degrees below zero, while the combination of wind and snow created visibility that dropped to mere inches. For the 5 team members who had descended to the 15,000-foot camp, the storm became a desperate struggle for their own survival. They abandoned one of their tents and crowded into a single 3-person shelter, using their combined body heat to stay alive. With no room to operate their stove in the cramped quarters, They survived on foods that required no cooking. Jerry Lewis and Anshel Schiff grew increasingly weak from the ordeal, while Wilcox and Snyder began experiencing numbness in their extremities that signaled the early stages of frostbite. The storm raged for 6 consecutive days, far longer than anyone had anticipated possible. During brief breaks in the weather, the survivors at 15,000 feet could see nothing of their teammates above. No movement, no signals, no signs of life could be detected from the high camp or the summit region where 7 men remained trapped in the planet's most violent conditions. On July 23rd, the weather finally broke enough for the 5 survivors to begin their descent. They were assisted by members of the Mountaineering Club of Alaska, who had weathered the storm at lower elevations and immediately began organizing search efforts for the missing 7. The survivors reached base camp on July 25th, and Wilcox crossed Wonder Lake to the ranger station to coordinate rescue operations. The search teams that climbed toward the high camp discovered a scene that would haunt rescuers for decades. At the remnants of the 18,000-foot camp, they found the body of one climber clutching a tent pole, frozen upright in a position that suggested he had died while trying to hold the shelter against the hurricane-force winds. The body had already begun decomposing, with exposed flesh showing evidence of repeated thawing and refreezing cycles. Due to the condition of the remains, positive identification was impossible, though searchers believed it was likely Steve Taylor, who had remained at the high camp during the summit attempt. Higher up the mountain, near Archdeacon's Tower at approximately 19,000 feet, searchers made an even more disturbing discovery. 2 bodies were found sitting upright at the base of the rock formation, positioned as if they had been bracing themselves against the wind when death overcame them. Unlike the body at the high camp, these remains showed no signs of decomposition, perfectly preserved by the extreme cold. The men appeared to have died while attempting to descend directly from the upper reaches of the mountain, taking a dangerous shortcut that led them into unsurvivable terrain. Paul Schlichter, one of the survivors, later speculated that these bodies belonged to Dennis Luchterhand and Walt Taylor, who had been among the strongest and most physically capable members of the expedition. Their position suggested they had attempted to make a desperate dash directly down the mountain's steep slopes toward the 15,000-foot camp, a route that would have been extremely dangerous even in good conditions. In the midst of the historic storm, it proved fatal. Evidence found near the Harper Icefall, between the high camp and the survivors' location, painted a tragic picture of at least one team member's final moments. Steve Taylor's ice axe and sleeping bag were discovered near a crevasse with a compromised snow bridge. Rescuers theorized that he had planted his axe and draped his sleeping bag around it as a signal to the team below before either falling through the weakened snow or being overcome by the storm while attempting to continue his descent. The fate of Dion and the 3 other team members remains a mystery that has never been solved. John Russell, Mark McLaughlin, Jerry Clark, and Dion Mitchell simply vanished into the white fury of the storm. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The mountain had claimed them so completely that no trace would ever be found, leaving their families without closure and the mountaineering community without answers. In the aftermath of the disaster, investigators and meteorologists conducted extensive studies to understand the unprecedented nature of the storm. The National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration concluded that the weather conditions encountered by Clark's team were genuinely unsurvivable by any person, regardless of experience, equipment, or preparation. Wind speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, combined with temperatures far below zero and complete visibility loss, created an environment more hostile than the surface of some planets. The tragedy sparked intense debate within the mountaineering community about responsibility, preparation, and the role of park authorities in preventing such disasters. Joe Wilcox, as expedition leader, faced severe criticism for his team's late start on the summit day, and his decision to climb with the more experienced Colorado group rather than waiting for his original team members. Critics argued that stronger leadership might have prevented the deaths by forcing a complete descent before the storm arrived. For years, Wilcox carried the burden of guilt, believing he could have made different decisions that might have saved his teammates' lives. It was only after the comprehensive meteorological studies were completed that he began to accept what the data clearly showed. No human intervention could have prevented the tragedy once the storm reached its full intensity. The 7 men who died on Denali were not victims of poor planning or inadequate leadership, but of nature's most extreme and unpredictable fury. The 1967 Wilcox expedition disaster remains the deadliest climbing accident in Denali's history and stands as one of the most controversial mountaineering tragedies ever recorded. The loss of 7 experienced climbers in a single storm event sent shockwaves through the climbing community and led to significant changes in how expeditions approach the mountain. Weather forecasting, communication protocols, and emergency response procedures were all improved in direct response to the lessons learned from this catastrophic event. Dion Mitchell's dream of conquering Denali ended not in triumph at the summit, but in a frozen nightmare from which he would never return. His body, along with those of Clark, Russell, and McLaughlin, remains somewhere on the mountain's upper slopes, claimed by the Great One in its most violent and unforgiving demonstration of power. The 1967 disaster serves as an eternal reminder that in the world's most extreme environments, even perfect preparation cannot guarantee survival when nature decides to unleash its full wrath. The families of the 7 lost climbers eventually found some measure of peace in understanding that their loved ones did not die due to recklessness or poor judgment, but while pursuing a dream that demanded everything they had to give. The mountain they sought to conquer instead became their final resting place, a monument to both human ambition and the awesome power of the natural world. In the annals of mountaineering history, the Wilcox expedition stands as a sobering reminder that some challenges exact the ultimate price, regardless of courage, skill, or determination. Indiana Mercer had been leading expedition groups up Denali for 12 years when the 2018 climbing season brought him the most troubling client he would ever encounter. Marcus Webb, a 36-year-old investment banker from Chicago, had paid double the standard rate for a private guided ascent, insisting on complete discretion regarding his identity and background. What initially appeared to be wealthy eccentricity would gradually reveal itself as something far more sinister, culminating in a death that park rangers would investigate as the first suspected murder in Denali's documented climbing history. Webb had contacted Denali Peak Expeditions in February 2018, requesting a solo guide for a May ascent via the West Buttress route. His financial records showed multiple wire transfers from offshore accounts, and he insisted on using only cash payments for any additional expenses. During their initial planning meetings in Anchorage, Indiana noticed several red flags about his new client. Webb claimed extensive mountaineering experience but could not provide details about previous expeditions when asked. His gear was expensive but clearly unused, still bearing manufacturer tags and plastic wrapping. Most concerning was Webb's apparent lack of familiarity with basic climbing terminology and safety protocols, despite his claims of having summited major peaks worldwide. The expedition began on May 8, 2018, with Webb demonstrating fitness levels that contradicted his supposed climbing background. He struggled with tasks that should have been second nature to an experienced mountaineer, such as properly securing his harness, reading altitude readings, and maintaining proper crampon technique on icy terrain. Indiana found himself constantly correcting fundamental mistakes that suggested Webb had never been on a serious mountain before this expedition. When questioned about his inconsistencies, Webb became defensive and changed the subject, often mentioning urgent business calls he needed to make once they descended. As they established their base camp at 7,000 feet, Indiana began to notice Webb's unusual behavior patterns during their evening conversations. Webb would frequently check his satellite phone for messages, becoming visibly agitated when calls failed to connect due to weather interference. He carried multiple electronic devices despite the weight concerns that typically forced climbers to minimize non-essential equipment. Most troubling were the phone conversations Indiana overheard during their second night on the mountain, when Webb thought his guide was asleep inside their shared tent. Speaking in hushed tones, Webb repeatedly used phrases like, "The problem will be solved permanently," and "No one will ever find anything up here." When Indiana stirred in his sleeping bag, Webb immediately ended the call and claimed he had been leaving voicemails for his office. The guide's mountaineering instincts, honed by years of reading dangerous weather and avalanche conditions, began sending him warnings about his client that had nothing to do with climbing hazards. Something about Marcus Webb felt fundamentally wrong, and Indiana started making mental notes about the man's behavior for his own safety. On May 12th, as they prepared to move from Camp 2 to Camp 3 at 11,000 feet, another climbing party joined their route. Sarah Chen, a biochemist from Seattle, was attempting Denali with her climbing partner James Morrison, a photographer documenting her expedition for a magazine feature. The trio had been ascending independently, but fell behind schedule due to Morrison's struggle with altitude sickness. When they encountered Indiana and Webb at the established campsite, standard mountaineering courtesy dictated sharing the sheltered location and coordinating their ascent efforts for mutual safety. Webb's demeanor changed dramatically upon meeting the other climbers, particularly Sarah Chen. He became unusually interested in her background, asking probing questions about her research, her family, and why she had chosen to climb Denali. Indiana noticed that Webb's inquiries went far beyond normal expedition small talk, bordering on interrogation. When Sarah mentioned her work developing new pharmaceutical compounds at her Seattle laboratory, Webb's attention intensified. He began finding excuses to be near her tent, offering to help with tasks she could clearly handle independently, and positioning himself to overhear her satellite phone calls to friends and colleagues back home. James Morrison's altitude sickness worsened significantly at the 11,000-foot camp, forcing a difficult decision about the expedition's continuation. Standard protocol required either complete descent for medical attention or evacuation if his condition deteriorated further. Sarah faced the heartbreaking choice of abandoning her summit attempt to accompany her partner down the mountain or continuing with Indiana's group, while Morrison descended with emergency support. After consulting with park rangers via radio, they determined that Morrison's symptoms were serious, but not immediately life-threatening, allowing him to make a controlled descent with the assistance of a rescue team ascending from base camp. This development left Sarah as the sole member of her original expedition, making her vulnerable in ways that Webb seemed to recognize immediately. He suggested that she join their group for the remainder of the ascent, ostensibly for safety reasons, but his offer carried undertones that made Indiana increasingly uncomfortable. The guide's years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts about people in high-stress environments, and every instinct was screaming that Webb represented a danger to Sarah Chen that had nothing to do with mountaineering hazards. As the modified three-person expedition continued their ascent toward the 14,000-foot camp, Webb's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He insisted on carrying Sarah's satellite phone, claiming he could get better signal reception due to his equipment positioning. He began making decisions about route selection and rest stops without consulting Indiana, despite the guide's obvious expertise and authority. Most disturbing was Webb's growing obsession with Sarah's personal information, asking detailed questions about her living situation, work schedule, and whether anyone was expecting to hear from her during the expedition. Indiana's attempts to speak privately with Sarah were consistently thwarted by Webb, who seemed to monitor their interactions with paranoid intensity. When the guide tried to express his concerns about their client during a brief moment when Webb was supposedly answering nature's call, Sarah revealed that she had been having similar uncomfortable feelings about the man. She had begun to suspect that Webb was not who he claimed to be, noting inconsistencies in his stories about his business background and previous climbing experience. More concerning, she had overheard him making phone calls that suggested he was tracking her movements and activities prior to the expedition. The situation reached a critical point on May 15th as the team prepared for their summit push from the 17,000-foot high camp. Weather conditions were optimal, with clear skies and minimal wind providing the perfect window for their ascent to the 20,310-foot summit. However, during their pre-dawn preparations, Sarah discovered that her summit pack had been tampered with overnight. Essential gear was missing, including her emergency beacon, first aid supplies, and backup communication device. When confronted, Webb claimed he had reorganized their equipment for weight distribution purposes, but could not account for the missing safety items. Indiana made the difficult decision to postpone the summit attempt due to these equipment irregularities and his growing concerns about Webb's mental state. Standard guide protocols required ensuring client safety above all other considerations, and something about the current situation felt fundamentally dangerous. Webb reacted with explosive anger, accusing Indiana of sabotaging his expedition and threatening legal action for breach of contract. His rage was disproportionate to the delay, suggesting that timing was critically important for reasons unrelated to weather or climbing conditions. During the heated argument that followed, Sarah made a discovery that would later prove crucial to investigators. While Webb was shouting at Indiana near the edge of their camp, she noticed a small recording device that had fallen from his jacket pocket. The device was still active, showing a red recording light, and appeared to be documenting their entire expedition. When she confronted him about the unauthorized recording, Webb's demeanor shifted from anger to something much more menacing. He claimed the device was for his personal expedition documentation, but his explanation was clearly fabricated. That evening, as the team remained in the high camp due to rapidly deteriorating weather conditions, Webb made his fatal mistake. Believing that Indiana was asleep in his tent and that Sarah was isolated in her shelter, he attempted to enter her tent during the pre-dawn hours of May 16th. Sarah's screams alerted Indiana, who emerged to find Webb restraining her with climbing rope while holding what appeared to be a syringe. The guide immediately recognized the situation as an attempted assault, and possibly worse, given Webb's strange behavior throughout the expedition. The confrontation that followed occurred at over 17,000 feet in complete darkness during a developing storm that would trap them at the high camp for 3 additional days. Indiana tackled Webb to prevent his attack on Sarah, and both men fought desperately on the narrow ledge that served as their campsite. Webb proved surprisingly strong and vicious in combat, using climbing tools as weapons and fighting with a desperation that suggested he believed his life depended on the outcome. During the struggle, both men came dangerously close to the camp's edge, where a fall would mean certain death on the glaciated slopes thousands of feet below. The fight ended when Webb lost his footing on the icy platform and fell backwards toward the precipice. Indiana lunged forward, managing to grab his client's jacket as he went over the edge, and for several crucial seconds, held Webb's life in his hands as the man dangled above a terminal fall. In that moment, Webb revealed the truth about his identity and his reasons for being on Denali. He was not Marcus Webb, but rather Vincent Crawford, a fugitive from federal murder charges in connection with 3 previous deaths in Colorado and Wyoming. Sarah Chen had been his intended 4th victim, selected because her isolated expedition provided the perfect opportunity to dispose of evidence in Denali's unforgiving wilderness. Crawford also confessed that he had been monitoring Sarah's communications and expedition planning for months, learning her schedule, and deliberately booking with the same guide service to gain access to her during the climb. The pharmaceutical research she conducted had made her wealthy, and Crawford had developed an elaborate scheme to murder her on the mountain and claim her research as his own through forged documents. Her death would appear to be a tragic climbing accident, with her body lost forever in one of Denali's countless crevasses. Faced with this horrifying revelation and Crawford's threats to kill both climbers if he survived the fall, Indiana made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of attempting to pull Crawford back to safety, he released his grip and let the would-be murderer fall into the darkness below. Crawford's screams echoed off the mountain walls before ending abruptly in the sound of impact far beneath their position. The storm that had been building throughout the confrontation immediately intensified, making any attempt at recovery impossible and burying all evidence of the fight under several feet of fresh snow. Indiana and Sarah spent the next 3 days trapped at the high camp, enduring hurricane-force winds and temperatures that reached 30 degrees below zero. During their enforced confinement, Sarah revealed additional details about Crawford's stalking behavior that painted a picture of a methodical predator who had been planning her murder for nearly a year. She had received strange phone calls and noticed unusual activity around her Seattle home, but had attributed these incidents to stress from work rather than recognizing them as signs of being targeted by a killer. When the storm finally cleared on May 19th, Indiana and Sarah began their descent, reporting Crawford's death to park rangers as a tragic accident during the overnight storm. They described how their client had left his tent during the worst of the weather, presumably to answer nature's call, and had not returned by morning. The extreme conditions made it impossible to conduct an immediate search, and both survivors assumed Crawford had become disoriented in the whiteout conditions and fallen to his death. The official investigation that followed revealed the disturbing truth about Crawford's identity and criminal background. Federal authorities had been tracking him for 18 months in connection with the murders of 3 women in Colorado and Wyoming, all of whom had been killed during isolated outdoor activities where their deaths could be attributed to accidents. Crawford had used multiple false identities to gain access to his victims, employing his charm and apparent wealth to overcome their natural caution about strangers. DNA evidence recovered from Sarah's tent and the climbing rope Crawford had used in his attack confirmed his identity and provided physical proof of his attempted assault. The recording device Sarah had discovered contained hours of incriminating audio, including Crawford's detailed plans for her murder and disposal of her body in one of Denali's deep crevasses. Most chilling were recordings he had made during previous expeditions, including audio from his earlier murders that demonstrated a pattern of using outdoor activities to isolate and kill his victims. The recovery of Crawford's body took place 3 weeks after his fall, when improved weather conditions allowed a helicopter search of the area below the high camp. His remains were found at the base of a 1,000-foot cliff, with injuries consistent with a fall from the campsite elevation. However, the condition of his body and the scattered equipment around the impact site raised questions among investigators about the exact circumstances of his death. Some evidence suggested that Crawford might have been alive when he hit the bottom, dying from exposure rather than impact injuries. Indiana Mercer faced extensive questioning from both park rangers and federal investigators, who needed to determine whether Crawford's death constituted self-defense, justifiable homicide, or murder. The guide's account of the confrontation was corroborated by Sarah's testimony and the physical evidence found at the scene, including signs of a violent struggle and Crawford's attempted assault. Ultimately, federal prosecutors determined that Indiana had acted appropriately in protecting both himself and Sarah from an armed and dangerous fugitive who had already demonstrated lethal intent. The psychological aftermath of the incident proved more difficult than the legal resolution. Indiana struggled with guilt over his decision to release Crawford rather than attempt a rescue, despite the clear evidence that Crawford intended to kill both climbers if given the opportunity. Sarah Chen required extensive therapy to cope with the trauma of nearly being murdered during what should have been a triumphant personal achievement. Both survivors found their lives forever changed by their encounter with a predator who had chosen Denali as his killing ground. The Crawford case became the first documented instance of premeditated murder being attempted on Denali, shocking the mountaineering community and prompting new safety protocols for guide services operating on the mountain. Background checks for clients became more stringent, and guides received training in recognizing potential threats that went beyond traditional mountaineering hazards. The incident also highlighted the vulnerability of climbers in remote locations where traditional law enforcement response is impossible. For Indiana Mercer, the 2018 season marked the end of his guiding career on Denali. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing in Crawford's death, he could no longer find peace in the high places that had once been his sanctuary. The mountain that had been his life's passion became a reminder of the evil that humans could carry even to the most pristine wilderness areas. He relocated to the lower 48 states, where he now teaches climbing safety to law enforcement personnel, using his experience with Crawford to help others recognize and respond to predatory behavior in outdoor settings. The case remains a stark reminder that danger on Denali does not come only from weather, altitude, or avalanches. Sometimes the greatest threat is the person sharing your rope, your tent, and your trust. In the wilderness, where help is days away and evidence can be buried forever under tons of snow and ice, the mountains become the perfect cover for those who hunt human prey. Crawford's death prevented what would have been the first successful murder on Denali, but his presence on the mountain proved that even the most remote places on Earth are not beyond the reach of human evil. Jalen Hartwell had been operating the Emergency Communications Center at Denali National Park for 8 years when the impossible radio transmissions began arriving on the morning of June 14th, 2019. As the lead radio operator for park rescue services, she had handled thousands of emergency calls from climbers in distress, coordinating everything from routine evacuations to complex multi-day search operations. Nothing in her extensive experience, however, had prepared her for the series of desperate pleas for help that would arrive from coordinates where no registered expedition existed, no climbing permits had been issued, and no human presence should have been possible. The first transmission crackled through the emergency frequency at 6:47 a.m., interrupting the routine morning weather briefing that Jalen was conducting with ranger stations throughout the park. The voice was male, estimated to be in his 20s or 30s, speaking with what sounded like a slight southern accent despite the heavy static that distorted his words. The caller identified himself as Kevin Morrison and claimed to be trapped with 3 other climbers at approximately 19,000 feet on Denali's south face, a location that would place him well above any established climbing routes and in an area considered technically impossible to access without specialized equipment. Morrison's distress was unmistakable as he described his team's desperate situation. According to his radio transmission, they had been attempting an unauthorized ascent via an uncharted route when an avalanche had swept away most of their climbing gear, leaving them stranded on a narrow ledge with no means of descent. 2 members of his party were severely injured, one with what appeared to be a compound fracture of the leg, and another suffering from symptoms consistent with severe altitude sickness. Morrison begged for immediate helicopter evacuation, providing coordinates that placed his position on a nearly vertical rock face where landing would be impossible, even under optimal conditions. Jalen immediately began standard emergency protocols, attempting to verify Morrison's location and gather additional information needed to coordinate a rescue response. However, when she requested his expedition permit number and departure date, Morrison became evasive, claiming that his paperwork was buried in their scattered equipment and that time was running out for his injured teammates. More concerning was his inability to provide basic information that any legitimate climber would know, such as the names of the established camps below his position or the route designation he had been attempting to follow. The emergency response team dispatched to investigate Morrison's coordinates found no evidence of any climbing activity in the reported area. Helicopter reconnaissance revealed pristine snow conditions with no tracks, abandoned equipment, or signs of recent avalanche activity. The coordinates Morrison had provided would have required his team to traverse several miles of previously unclimbed terrain, including sections of technical ice climbing that would be beyond the skill level of most recreational mountaineers. Furthermore, park records showed no expedition permits issued to anyone named Kevin Morrison for the entire 2019 climbing season. Despite the mounting inconsistencies, rescue operations continued throughout the day as Morrison's transmissions grew increasingly frantic. His second radio call, received at 11:23 a.m., painted an even more dire picture of their situation. He reported that one of the injured climbers had died during the night, presumably from hypothermia, and that the remaining survivor with the broken leg was losing consciousness. Morrison's voice carried a desperation that seemed genuine, filled with the kind of raw panic that experienced radio operators learn to recognize in legitimate emergency situations. The search area was expanded to include adjacent valleys and alternative route possibilities, with teams of experienced mountaineers dispatched to investigate every conceivable location where Morrison's group might actually be stranded. Advanced GPS equipment was used to verify the coordinates he had provided, confirming that the specified location was indeed a sheer rock wall where no horizontal ledge existed large enough to accommodate multiple climbers. Weather conditions throughout the search area were optimal, with clear visibility and minimal wind that should have made any legitimate rescue signals easily detectable. Morrison's third transmission, arriving at 4:15 p.m., introduced elements that defied both logic and established climbing practices. He claimed that his team had been on the mountain for 11 days, surviving on minimal food supplies and melted snow, yet his voice showed no signs of the weakness or confusion typically associated with prolonged, high-altitude exposure and dehydration. More puzzling was his description of weather conditions that contradicted meteorological data collected by automated stations throughout the park. Morrison reported experiencing heavy snowfall and hurricane-force winds, while nearby monitoring equipment recorded clear skies and calm conditions. The investigation took a disturbing turn when Jalen discovered that Kevin Morrison was the name of a climber who had disappeared on Denali during an expedition in 1987, 32 years before the current radio transmissions began. Park archives revealed that Morrison, age 28 at the time of his disappearance, had been attempting a solo ascent of the mountain's south face when he vanished without a trace. His body was never recovered despite extensive search efforts, and his disappearance remained one of the park's most enduring unsolved cases. Photographs from the 1987 expedition showed a young man matching the age and general description suggested by the voice in the radio transmissions. Morrison's 1987 climbing permit indicated that he had been attempting the same general route described in the current emergency calls, though his planned itinerary would not have taken him to the specific coordinates being reported. Even more unsettling was the discovery that Morrison's radio equipment from 1987 had used the same emergency frequency that was now carrying the distress calls, despite significant changes in communication protocols implemented over the intervening decades. The psychological impact on the rescue teams grew more pronounced as Morrison's calls continued throughout the evening hours. His fourth transmission at 8:52 p.m. included background voices that appeared to be other members of his climbing party. These additional voices could be heard making comments about their deteriorating situation and discussing rescue options. Yet audio analysis revealed acoustic properties inconsistent with normal human speech patterns. The voices seemed to echo in ways that suggested vast open spaces rather than the confined ledge Morrison had described as their location. Advanced radio direction-finding equipment was deployed in an attempt to pinpoint the exact source of Morrison's transmissions. Multiple triangulation attempts using receivers positioned at various elevations around the mountain produced results that violated basic principles of radio wave propagation. The signals appeared to be originating from multiple locations simultaneously, including positions deep within the mountain itself, where radio transmission should be impossible. Some readings suggested the source was moving at speeds that would require aircraft or other mechanical assistance, yet radar surveillance detected no air traffic in the relevant areas. The overnight search operations revealed additional anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of the situation. Morrison's fifth radio call, received at 2:33 a.m. on June 15th, described sunrise conditions and improving weather. Yet, his reported location would have been in complete darkness for several more hours, according to established solar positioning data. His description of the sunrise included details about surrounding peaks and valleys that accurately matched the view from his claimed coordinates, suggesting intimate familiarity with the terrain despite the impossibility of his presence there. Jalen's growing unease was shared by other members of the rescue coordination team, who began experiencing technical difficulties with their communication equipment whenever Morrison's transmissions were active. Radio interference patterns suggested the presence of powerful broadcasting equipment far beyond the capabilities of standard climbing radios. Yet electromagnetic spectrum analysis detected no unauthorized transmissions in the relevant frequencies. The mysterious signals appeared to be somehow inserting themselves into the established communication network without leaving any detectable electronic signature. The breakthrough in understanding Morrison's impossible transmissions came when a retired park ranger named Thomas Chen contacted the emergency center with information about similar radio calls he had received during his tenure in the 1990s. Chen reported that mysterious distress signals from the same general coordinates had been a recurring phenomenon for over 2 decades, always featuring male voices claiming to be stranded climbers in need of immediate rescue. The calls typically occurred during periods of high climbing activity and always reported situations that proved impossible to verify through physical search operations. Chen's records, maintained in personal files that predated modern digital archiving systems, documented 17 separate incidents involving phantom radio transmissions from the Denali South Face area. The calls had been reported by multiple radio operators over the years, with consistent descriptions of male voices requesting emergency assistance from locations that could not be reached or verified. Each incident had prompted extensive search operations that found no evidence of actual climbers in distress, leading to the unofficial designation of the phenomenon as equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. The historical pattern revealed disturbing consistencies in the phantom transmissions that suggested something beyond random technical glitches. The reported climbing scenarios always involved groups of 3 or 4 people, with at least one member suffering serious injuries and another dying during the course of the emergency. The voices consistently demonstrated detailed knowledge of mountaineering terminology and Denali-specific geographic features, yet provided coordinates and route descriptions that were geographically impossible. Most unsettling was the recurring use of names that matched climbers who had disappeared on the mountain in previous decades. Morrison's final transmission was received at 11:47 a.m. on June 15th, nearly 30 hours after his initial distress call. His voice had changed dramatically, becoming weak and distant in a way that suggested approaching death from exposure and altitude sickness. He reported that the last surviving member of his team had died during the night, leaving him alone on the ledge with no hope of rescue. Morrison's farewell message included specific instructions for contacting his family in Tennessee and requests that his personal effects be recovered from their base camp, which he claimed was located at coordinates that placed it in the middle of a glacial crevasse field. The emotional impact of Morrison's final transmission affected even experienced rescue personnel who had dealt with numerous tragic climbing accidents over their careers. The raw desperation in his voice, combined with his detailed descriptions of watching his teammates die one by one, created a psychological connection that made rational analysis of the situation extremely difficult. Several members of the search teams reported feeling profound guilt about their inability to locate and assist Morrison, despite the mounting evidence that his transmissions were somehow impossible. The investigation into the phantom radio phenomenon continued for several months after Morrison's final transmission, involving collaboration between Park Service personnel, Federal Communications Commission investigators, and academic researchers specializing in atmospheric physics and radio wave propagation. Extensive testing of communication equipment throughout the park revealed no technical malfunctions that could account for the mysterious signals. Atmospheric analysis showed no unusual ionospheric conditions that might cause radio waves to behave in unexpected ways. The most comprehensive theory developed by researchers suggested that the phantom transmissions might be caused by a rare atmospheric phenomenon known as anomalous propagation, where radio signals from distant sources are reflected and distorted by unusual atmospheric conditions. However, this explanation failed to account for the specific content of Morrison's transmissions, which demonstrated real-time responsiveness to questions and changing conditions rather than simple playback of recorded material. The geographic accuracy of his descriptions also could not be explained by random atmospheric interference. Alternative theories proposed by some investigators included the possibility that the transmissions were elaborate hoaxes created by individuals with advanced technical knowledge and access to powerful radio equipment. However, the technical requirements for simulating the observed signal characteristics would exceed the capabilities of most amateur radio operators, and the extensive coordination required to maintain the deception over multiple decades seemed unlikely. The emotional authenticity of the distress calls also argued against deliberate fabrication, as the voices displayed psychological patterns consistent with genuine extreme stress. The psychological impact on Jalen and other radio operators who had handled the Morrison transmissions proved to be long-lasting and professionally significant. The experience of listening to detailed descriptions of death and suffering while being unable to provide assistance challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of emergency response work. Several personnel requested transfers to other positions, citing their inability to maintain objective professional distance from calls that might or might not represent real emergencies. The Denali phantom radio phenomenon remains an active area of investigation within the National Park Service, with protocols established for documenting and analyzing similar future incidents. Communication equipment throughout the park has been upgraded with digital recording capabilities to capture complete audio and technical data for any mysterious transmissions. Training programs for radio operators now include information about the historical pattern of phantom calls and procedures for distinguishing between genuine emergencies and unexplained phenomena. The case of Kevin Morrison's impossible radio transmissions serves as a reminder that, even in the age of advanced technology and scientific understanding, some mysteries continue to defy rational explanation. Whether the phantom calls represent unknown atmospheric phenomena, elaborate technical hoaxes, or something beyond current scientific comprehension, They highlight the profound isolation and vulnerability experienced by those who venture into the world's most remote places. In the vast wilderness of Denali, where reality itself can become distorted by extreme conditions and psychological stress, the line between possible and impossible sometimes disappears entirely. For Jalen Hartwell, the Morrison incident marked the end of her career in emergency communications, as the psychological burden of potentially ignoring real distress calls became too great to bear. She relocated to lower altitude work in the Park Service, but continues to monitor radio frequencies during her off hours, listening for voices that call from places where no one should be, seeking help that may never come. The phantom transmissions continue to arrive periodically, carrying the same desperate pleas for rescue from coordinates where only ghosts can climb. Kaylin Rodriguez had survived 3 previous avalanches during her 15-year mountaineering career, but nothing had prepared her for the catastrophic wall of ice and snow that would claim the lives of her 8 teammates at Denali's Advanced Base Camp on April 22, 2021. As the expedition's glaciologist and avalanche safety specialist, she had assessed the snowpack conditions and deemed their campsite location relatively secure from major slide activity. The massive Sirac collapse that triggered the deadliest avalanche in modern Denali history would prove that even expert analysis could not account for the mountain's most unpredictable and violent moods. The International Alpine Research Expedition had arrived at Kahiltna Base Camp on April 10, 2021, representing a collaboration between universities from 4 different countries studying the effects of climate change on high-altitude glacial systems. The 9-member team included some of the world's most experienced high-altitude researchers, with collective expedition experience spanning every major peak on the planet. Kaylin, a professor of glaciology at the University of Colorado, had been selected to lead the team's avalanche safety protocols due to her extensive background in snow science and her previous successful ascents of Denali via multiple routes. The expedition's scientific objectives required establishing a semi-permanent research station at approximately 13,000 feet, positioned to collect long-term data on ice movement, temperature variations, and atmospheric conditions throughout the climbing season. This location, designated as Advanced Base Camp, was situated on a broad glacier plateau that appeared to offer excellent protection from avalanche hazards based on topographic analysis and historical weather data. The camp would serve as both a research facility and a staging area for the team's planned summit attempt scheduled for early May. The team's composition reflected the expedition's dual scientific and mountaineering objectives. In addition to Kaylin, the group included Dr. Erik Johansson, a Swedish atmospheric physicist with extensive Arctic expedition experience, Maria Santos, a Spanish high-altitude medicine specialist who had conducted research on 4 previous Himalayan expeditions, Dr. Chen Wei-Ming, a Chinese glaciologist who had led successful research teams to both poles, and 5 graduate students from various institutions who had been selected for their combination of academic credentials and mountaineering skills. The initial 3 days of establishing Advanced Base Camp proceeded without incident, with team members working efficiently to construct the research station's infrastructure and organize scientific equipment. Kaylin conducted daily avalanche assessments of the surrounding terrain, paying particular attention to the massive hanging glacier system visible above their position on the mountain's south-facing slopes. Her evaluations consistently indicated minimal avalanche risk from the established camp location, with natural terrain features appearing to channel any potential slide activity well away from their operational area. The team's daily routine involved collecting scientific data in the morning hours, when temperature conditions provided optimal readings for their various instruments, followed by afternoon sessions organizing equipment and conducting physical training for their upcoming summit attempt. Evening hours were devoted to data analysis and communication with their respective universities via satellite internet connections. The work was demanding but rewarding, with preliminary results suggesting that their research would contribute significantly to understanding climate change impacts on glacial systems. Weather conditions throughout the first 2 weeks of the expedition remained generally favorable for both scientific work and mountaineering activities, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that allowed team members to work comfortably at altitude. However, Kaylin noticed subtle changes in the snowpack characteristics around their camp that suggested the glacier system above them was experiencing increased stress due to warming temperatures. Her snow stability tests revealed layers within the snowpack that showed concerning signs of weakness, though not in patterns that would typically indicate immediate avalanche danger. The warning signs became more pronounced on April 20th, when the team experienced the first of several minor ice releases from the hanging glacier system approximately 2,000 feet above their position. These relatively small avalanches, each involving several tons of ice and snow, followed predictable paths down established gullies that carried the debris safely away from the research camp. However, the frequency of these releases, occurring every few hours throughout the day, suggested that the entire glacier system was becoming increasingly unstable due to temperature fluctuations and structural stresses. Kaylin's concerns about the changing conditions prompted her to recommend relocating the research station to a more protected position, further from the hanging glacier system. However, moving the camp would require dismantling and reconstructing the scientific equipment installations, potentially losing several days of valuable data collection during the optimal research window. After extensive discussion and analysis of available alternatives, the team voted to maintain their current position while implementing enhanced safety protocols and establishing evacuation procedures in case conditions deteriorated further. The decision to remain at the established camp location was influenced by several factors that seemed reasonable at the time, but would prove tragically inadequate when confronted with the mountain's most extreme behavior. The camp's position appeared to be well outside the natural run-out zones for avalanches from the visible glacier system above them. Historical records showed no previous avalanche activity reaching their elevation and location during the documented climbing season. Most importantly, weather forecasts indicated a period of stable conditions that should reduce the likelihood of major ice releases. On the evening of April 21st, the team gathered for their regular briefing session to review scientific progress and plan the following day's activities. Data collection had been exceptionally successful, with several instruments recording measurements that exceeded their initial research objectives. Team morale was high as members discussed their upcoming summit attempt and the potential impact of their research findings on the broader scientific community. Kaylin presented her daily avalanche assessment, noting continued minor ice releases, but expressing confidence that their camp remained in a secure location. The catastrophic event began at 3:47 a.m. on April 22nd, when a massive section of the hanging glacier system suddenly collapsed without warning. Unlike the gradual releases that had characterized previous days, this failure involved an entire ice cliff, estimated to contain over 50,000 tons of material. The collapse triggered a cascading failure of adjacent glacier sections, creating an avalanche of unprecedented size and destructive power that defied all previous assessments of the terrain's avalanche potential. Kaylin was awakened by a sound unlike anything she had experienced in her mountaineering career, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from within the mountain itself and grew rapidly in intensity until it drowned out all other sounds. The initial moment of confusion gave way to immediate recognition of mortal danger, as she realized that the noise could only indicate a massive avalanche approaching their position. Her training and experience allowed her to react instantly, grabbing her emergency beacon an avalanche transceiver, while shouting warnings to her teammates in the surrounding tents. The wall of ice and snow that struck advanced base camp moved with a speed that made effective evacuation impossible, despite the brief warning provided by the sound of the approaching avalanche. Kaylin's last clear memory before being engulfed was seeing the massive white wall, estimated to be over 100 feet high, approaching their camp with the force and speed of an express train. The avalanche struck with such violence that it lifted entire sections of the camp and carried them hundreds of yards down the glacier before burying everything under tons of debris. Kaylin's survival was due to a combination of extraordinary luck and the specific dynamics of how the avalanche interacted with the camp's layout. Her tent was positioned at the very edge of the avalanche path, where the destructive force was diminished compared to the center of the slide. Instead of being completely buried, she was carried approximately 200 yards down the glacier and deposited in a natural depression where air pockets formed around her body. Her avalanche transceiver, activated during her initial response to the approaching danger, would prove crucial to her eventual rescue. The experience of being caught in the avalanche was described by Kaylin as complete sensory overload, followed by absolute darkness and silence. The initial impact felt like being hit by a freight train, with forces that tumbled her body in directions that defied gravity and spatial orientation. The snow behaved more like liquid concrete than the powder she had expected, filling her mouth, nose, and every opening in her clothing, while exerting crushing pressure on her chest that made breathing nearly impossible. When the avalanche finally stopped moving, Kaylin found herself buried under approximately 6 feet of densely packed snow in a space barely large enough to accommodate her body. The weight of the snow above her made movement extremely difficult, but she managed to create a small air pocket around her face, using techniques learned during avalanche survival training. Her immediate priorities became conserving oxygen, staying warm, and activating her emergency beacon to assist potential rescue efforts. The silence following the avalanche was profound and terrifying, broken only by the sound of her own labored breathing and the occasional settling of snow around her improvised shelter. She called out repeatedly for her teammates, hoping to hear responses that would indicate other survivors, but received no answers from the tons of debris that now covered their former campsite. The realization that she might be the sole survivor of the expedition began to settle over her as hours passed without any signs of life from the avalanche zone. Kaylin's survival training had emphasized the critical importance of remaining calm and conserving energy while trapped in avalanche debris, advice that proved essential during the 26 hours she would spend buried before rescue teams could locate her position. She used meditation techniques to control her anxiety and breathing, carefully rationing her limited air supply, while periodically attempting to expand her air pocket by melting snow with her body heat and removing it through small openings in her snow cave. The rescue operation began when the expedition failed to make their scheduled 8 a.m. radio check on April 22nd, prompting park rangers to initiate search procedures. However, the massive scale of the avalanche zone and the complex logistics required to reach their remote location meant that organized rescue efforts could not begin until the following day. Weather conditions further complicated the rescue operation, with high winds and reduced visibility preventing helicopter operations until conditions improved. The search team that finally reached the avalanche site on April 23rd was confronted with a debris field covering several acres and containing an estimated 75,000 tons of ice and snow. The complete destruction of the research camp meant that normal landmarks for locating buried victims were no longer visible, requiring searchers to rely entirely on avalanche transceivers and probe techniques to locate survivors. Kaylin's beacon signal provided the first and only indication that anyone had survived the catastrophic slide. The recovery of Kaylin's position required 8 hours of careful digging through densely packed avalanche debris, with rescuers working in rotating teams to avoid exhaustion at the high-altitude location. When they finally reached her improvised snow cave, she was conscious but severely hypothermic, having survived temperatures that reached 15 degrees below zero during her entombment. Her first words to rescuers were questions about her teammates, revealing her desperate hope that others had also survived the avalanche. The search for the remaining 8 expedition members continued for 5 additional days, involving over 50 rescue personnel and specialized equipment brought in by helicopter. However, the massive scale and density of the avalanche debris made recovery efforts extremely dangerous and ultimately unsuccessful. The bodies of Kaylin's teammates were never recovered, presumably buried too deeply under the avalanche debris to be reached safely by search teams. The investigation into the avalanche revealed conditions that exceeded all previous scientific understanding of glacier stability and avalanche formation in the Denali region. The hanging glacier system that collapsed had shown no visible signs of instability that would have warranted evacuation of the camp area. Temperature records indicated that thermal conditions were within normal ranges for the season, providing no obvious trigger for the massive glacier failure that caused the avalanche. Advanced computer modeling of the avalanche dynamics indicated that the slide reached speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour during its descent, carrying enough force to level mature forest and destroy reinforced structures. The debris field extended much further than any previous avalanche in the recorded history of Denali, reaching areas that had been considered completely safe from avalanche hazards based on topographic analysis and historical precedent. Kaylin's physical recovery from the avalanche required 3 months of intensive medical treatment for hypothermia, dehydration, and psychological trauma associated with her survival experience. However, her emotional recovery from the loss of her 8 teammates proved far more challenging and continues to affect her personal and professional life. She retired from active mountaineering following the incident, unable to find peace in the high places that had once been her greatest source of joy and professional fulfillment. The Denali avalanche of April 22, 2021, remains the deadliest single avalanche event in the mountain's recorded history and highlighted the limitations of current scientific understanding about glacier stability and avalanche prediction in rapidly changing climate conditions. The tragedy led to significant revisions in safety protocols for research expeditions operating in glacier environments and contributed to the development of new technologies for monitoring glacier stability in real time. The loss of 8 accomplished scientists and mountaineers in a single avalanche event sent shockwaves through both the academic and mountaineering communities, serving as a sobering reminder that even the most experienced and well-prepared individuals remain vulnerable to the mountain's most extreme and unpredictable behavior. For Kaylin Rodriguez, survival came at the cost of witnessing the complete destruction of everything and everyone that had defined her life's work, leaving her as the sole witness to a tragedy that defied all previous understanding of what was possible on Denali's treacherous slopes. Janae Thompson had established herself as one of the most skilled technical rope specialists in high-altitude mountaineering when she joined the 2020 Denali International Expedition as the team's lead climbing coordinator and safety equipment manager. Her expertise in rope systems, anchor construction, and rescue techniques had saved lives on 3 previous expeditions to major peaks worldwide, making her an invaluable addition to any serious mountaineering effort. What none of her 7 teammates knew was that their expedition would become the site of the first documented case of intentional equipment sabotage resulting in murder on Denali, a crime that would remain undetected for months until a chance discovery revealed the horrifying truth. The expedition was organized by Alpine Adventures International, a premium guide service specializing in technically challenging ascents for experienced climbers seeking routes beyond the standard tourist paths up Denali. The 8-member team represented diverse backgrounds and climbing experience levels, ranging from seasoned mountaineers with multiple major peak summits to ambitious intermediate climbers looking to test themselves against North America's highest mountain. Janae had been specifically recruited for the expedition due to her reputation for meticulous equipment maintenance and her ability to establish bomber anchor systems in challenging conditions. The team's planned route would take them up the technical Cassin Ridge, a challenging line that required advanced rock and ice climbing skills, as well as the ability to navigate complex terrain where equipment failure could prove instantly fatal. Unlike the more forgiving West Buttress route used by most Denali climbers, the Cassin Ridge offered no room for error and demanded absolute trust in both equipment and teammates. The route's reputation for technical difficulty and objective hazards made it an attractive challenge for experienced climbers, but also created conditions where sabotage could be disguised as equipment failure. From the beginning of the expedition, Janae noticed subtle tensions within the group that suggested underlying conflicts between certain team members. Marcus Webb, a successful investment banker from New York, had paid significantly more than the standard fee to join the expedition and seemed to expect special treatment commensurate with his financial contribution. His interactions with other team members were often condescending, particularly toward Sarah Chen, a research scientist whose quiet competence appeared to threaten his self-image as the expedition's natural leader. The conflict between Webb and Chen escalated during the approach march to base camp, when disagreements over route finding and pace setting revealed fundamental differences in their climbing philosophies and personalities. Webb favored aggressive tactics and tight schedules that prioritized summit success over safety margins, while Chen advocated for conservative decision-making that allowed adequate time for proper risk assessment. Their philosophical differences created a divisive atmosphere that affected the entire team's cohesion and mutual trust. Janae's responsibilities as equipment manager required her to inspect and maintain all climbing hardware throughout the expedition, including the dynamic ropes that would protect the team during the technical sections of their route. Her standard protocol involved daily inspections of critical safety equipment, looking for signs of wear, damage, or deterioration that could compromise performance when lives depended on absolute reliability. The high-quality ropes used by the expedition were rated for multiple Factor 2 falls and should have remained serviceable throughout the duration of their climb under normal conditions. The team's first technical challenge came at the base of the Cassin Ridge proper, where a series of mixed rock and ice pitches required establishing solid anchors and belaying each climber individually through the difficult terrain. Janae took the lead on this section, using her expertise to select optimal anchor placements and establish redundant safety systems that would protect the entire team during their ascent. The quality of her anchor work was immediately apparent to experienced team members, reinforcing confidence in her technical abilities and judgment. However, Webb's behavior during the technical climbing sections raised concerns among several team members, including Janae. His technique was adequate but lacked the fluidity and confidence expected from someone claiming extensive big wall experience. More troubling were his comments about other climbers' performance, particularly his repeated criticisms of Chen's climbing speed and route-finding decisions. Webb seemed determined to undermine Chen's confidence and position within the team, using his financial status and aggressive personality to dominate group decision-making. The sabotage occurred during the night of June 15th, while the team was camped at approximately 14,000 feet in preparation for their push through the route's most technical section. Janae had completed her evening equipment inspection and stored all climbing gear in the team's designated equipment tent, following standard protocols for protecting critical safety equipment from weather and accidental damage. Unknown to her or any other team member, Webb used his access to the equipment storage area to methodically weaken Chen's climbing rope, using a small knife blade to create nearly invisible cuts in the rope's outer sheath and inner core fibers. The sabotage was expertly executed to avoid detection during routine visual inspections, while ensuring catastrophic failure under the loading conditions that would occur during a climbing fall. Webb's cuts were positioned at a point approximately 30 feet from Chen's tie-in point, a location that would experience maximum stress during a fall while remaining hidden within the rope coils during normal handling. The damaged rope maintained its normal appearance and feel, showing no obvious signs of compromise that would alert Janae or other team members to the deadly trap that had been set. The team began their ascent of the route's technical crux section at dawn on June 16th, with climbers moving in rotating pairs to navigate the complex terrain efficiently while maintaining adequate safety margins. Chen was paired with David Martinez, an experienced guide from Colorado, while Webb climbed with Lisa Park, a photographer documenting the expedition. Janae climbed with expedition leader Robert Hayes, taking responsibility for establishing the primary anchor systems that would protect following climbers. The first indication that something was wrong came during Chen's attempt to negotiate a particularly challenging mixed pitch that required delicate footwork on thin ice over steep rock. As she moved through the crux sequence, a small hold broke under her weight, causing her to fall approximately 20 feet before the rope should have arrested her descent. Instead of the normal dynamic catch expected from a quality climbing rope, the line parted completely at the point where Webb had made his cuts, sending Chen into an uncontrolled fall down the steep terrain below. Martinez watched in horror as Chen tumbled past his belay position, unable to arrest her fall due to the complete rope failure that had eliminated their safety connection. Her body struck multiple rock projections and ice formations during the fall, suffering traumatic injuries that would have been prevented by a properly functioning rope system. The sound of her impact echoed across the mountain face, alerting other team members to the catastrophic accident that had just occurred. The rescue effort that followed revealed the full extent of Chen's injuries and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her fall. When Janae examined the failed rope, she immediately recognized that the failure pattern was inconsistent with normal wear or environmental damage. The clean cuts through both the outer sheath and inner core fibers showed characteristics of deliberate knife damage rather than the frayed appearance typical of ropes that fail due to abrasion or repeated loading. Her expertise in rope construction and failure analysis made it impossible to mistake the sabotage for accidental equipment failure. Chen remained conscious during the initial rescue efforts, allowing her to provide crucial information about the events leading up to her fall. She described experiencing unusual handling characteristics in her rope during the previous day's climbing, including a slight stiffness at one point that she had attributed to cold temperatures. More significantly, she reported that Webb had volunteered to help organize climbing equipment the previous evening, offering to coil ropes and arrange hardware to speed the team's morning departure. The evacuation of Chen from the technical terrain required 8 hours of complex rope rescue techniques, with team members working in challenging conditions to construct mechanical advantage systems capable of raising her injured body through steep terrain. Throughout the rescue operation, Webb's behavior struck several team members as oddly detached and unsympathetic, particularly given the severity of Chen's injuries and the life-threatening nature of her situation. His primary concerns seemed focused on the expedition's timeline and summit prospects rather than the welfare of his injured teammate. During the helicopter evacuation that finally transported Chen to medical facilities in Anchorage, Janae made the decision to preserve the failed rope as evidence rather than disposing of it as damaged equipment. Her mountaineering experience had exposed her to numerous equipment failures, and the characteristics of Chen's rope failure were unlike anything she had previously encountered. The deliberate nature of the cuts was unmistakable to anyone with expertise in rope construction and failure analysis. The investigation into the rope failure began when Chen's medical team noticed that her injury pattern was inconsistent with a typical climbing fall arrested by properly functioning safety equipment. Her injuries suggested an uncontrolled fall over significant vertical distance, indicating complete failure of her protection system, rather than the controlled deceleration provided by dynamic rope systems. This discrepancy prompted questions about the circumstances of her accident and the condition of her climbing equipment. When park rangers examined the failed rope that Janae had preserved, forensic analysis confirmed her initial assessment that the failure resulted from deliberate sabotage rather than equipment defect or environmental damage. The knife cuts showed characteristics consistent with a small blade used to systematically weaken the rope's load-bearing fibers while maintaining its external appearance. The sabotage had been carefully planned and executed to ensure failure under typical climbing loads while avoiding detection during routine equipment inspections. The criminal investigation that followed focused on identifying which team member had access to Chen's climbing rope and motivation for attempting to cause her death. Webb's financial background revealed significant gambling debts and involvement in fraudulent investment schemes that had put him under investigation by federal authorities. Chen's research work in pharmaceutical development had made her wealthy, and investigators discovered that Webb had attempted to establish himself as her business partner and potential heir through forged documents and identity theft. The evidence against Webb included fingerprints on Chen's climbing equipment, financial records showing his desperate need for money, and witness testimony about his hostile behavior toward Chen throughout the expedition. However, Webb's death in an apparent climbing accident during the team's descent from the mountain eliminated the possibility of criminal prosecution and left many questions about his motivations and methods unanswered. His body was recovered from a crevasse where he had apparently fallen while traveling unroped, though some team members suspected his death might have been suicide rather than accident. Chen's recovery from her injuries required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation, but she survived the assassination attempt and eventually returned to limited climbing activities. Her experience led to significant changes in expedition safety protocols, including requirements for tamper-evident seals on critical equipment and enhanced background screening for expedition members. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of climbers to internal threats from teammates who might have hidden agendas or criminal intentions. The Denali rope sabotage incident remains unique in mountaineering history as the first documented case of attempted murder through deliberate equipment failure on a major peak. The technical expertise required to execute the sabotage without detection demonstrated that the threat came from someone with intimate knowledge of climbing systems and failure modes. The case serves as a sobering reminder that in remote wilderness environments, the greatest danger may come not from natural hazards, but from human predators who use the isolation and apparent accidents of mountain climbing to cover their crimes. For Janie Thompson, the discovery of Webb's sabotage marked the end of her career as an expedition climbing coordinator, as the psychological impact of nearly losing a teammate to deliberate equipment tampering destroyed her ability to trust the safety systems that climbing depends upon. She transitioned to teaching rope rescue techniques to law enforcement and emergency response personnel, using her experience with the Chen case to help others recognize signs of equipment sabotage and develop protocols for preventing similar crimes. The legacy of Chen's near murder continues to influence mountaineering safety practices, with equipment manufacturers developing new technologies to detect tampering and expedition organizers implementing enhanced screening procedures for potential team members. The case proved that even in the most remote and challenging environments on Earth, human evil can follow, disguised as adventure and hidden behind the apparent camaraderie of shared risk and mutual dependence that defines high-altitude mountaineering. The mountains themselves remain indifferent to human conflicts and criminal intentions, but the climbing community has learned that trust and safety require more than technical competence and proper equipment. In places where help is days away and evidence can be buried forever under tons of snow and ice, vigilance against human threats becomes as important as preparation for natural hazards in ensuring that adventures in the high places do not become opportunities for those who hunt human prey. Kendricks Powell had been working as a helicopter pilot for Denali rescue operations for 13 years when he made the most disturbing discovery of his career on July 8, 2022. As the pilot for Alaska Glacier helicopters, he had responded to hundreds of emergency calls, evacuated injured climbers from impossible terrain, and recovered bodies from crevasses and avalanche zones. Nothing in his extensive experience with mountain tragedies, however, had prepared him for finding a fully operational base camp with hot food still cooking on stoves, personal belongings scattered as if their owners had just stepped away, and absolutely no trace of the 6-person expedition that had established the site. The discovery began with a routine welfare check requested by family members of the Arctic Research Expedition, a group of experienced mountaineers and scientists who had been conducting climate research on Denali's upper glaciers. The team, led by renowned glaciologist Dr. Amanda Chen, had maintained regular communication with their support team until July 5th, when their scheduled radio check failed to occur. 2 additional missed communications prompted their logistics coordinator to request a helicopter reconnaissance of their last known position at approximately 15,000 feet on the mountain's northeast face. The Arctic Research Expedition represented a collaboration between 3 major universities studying the effects of climate change on high-altitude ice formations and glacial movement patterns. The 6-member team included some of the world's most experienced cold-weather researchers, with collective expeditionary experience spanning both polar regions and every major mountain range on the planet. Dr. Chen herself had led successful research expeditions to Antarctica, Greenland, and the Himalayas, making her disappearance particularly puzzling given her reputation for meticulous safety protocols and conservative decision-making. When Kendricks approached the expedition's base camp location on the morning of July 8th, his initial impression was that everything appeared normal from the air. The camp layout showed the organized efficiency typical of experienced mountaineers, with tents positioned to take advantage of natural wind protection and equipment caches properly secured against weather. Solar panels were deployed to power scientific instruments, and weather monitoring equipment was actively collecting data. Nothing suggested distress, evacuation, or the kind of catastrophic event that would explain the team's sudden silence. Landing near the camp revealed the first disturbing details that indicated something was fundamentally wrong with the scene. 2 camp stoves were still burning under pots containing what appeared to be a partially prepared meal, suggesting that the team had been interrupted during routine food preparation. The stoves showed no signs of malfunction or fuel exhaustion, and the food in the pots was still warm to the touch, indicating that whoever had been cooking had left very recently, possibly within the previous hour. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the camp in patterns that defied explanation. Sleeping bags remained in tents with personal items like books, journals, and electronic devices positioned as if their owners intended to return momentarily. Several team members had left their boots outside their tents, an arrangement that no experienced mountaineer would maintain if they planned to be away from camp for any significant period. Most puzzling were the presence of expensive scientific instruments left unattended and unsecured, representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in research equipment. The expedition's communication equipment was fully functional and showed no signs of damage or malfunction that would explain their failure to maintain radio contact. battery levels were adequate, and all systems tested normally when Kendricks attempted to operate them. Weather monitoring instruments were actively recording data, and GPS units showed that the camp had been established in the exact location specified in the team's filed expedition plan. Everything suggested a fully operational research station that had been abandoned without warning or explanation. Dr. Chen's research journal, found open on a camp table, provided the most disturbing clues about the circumstances leading up to the team's disappearance. Her final entries, dated July 5th, described normal research activities and routine camp maintenance with no indication of concern about weather, equipment problems, or safety issues. Her handwriting showed no signs of distress or urgency, and her scientific observations continued right up to what appeared to be the moment of interruption, with a sentence ending mid-word, as if she had been suddenly called away. The team's emergency equipment remained completely unused and properly stowed in designated locations throughout the camp. Emergency beacons were still in their protective cases, medical supplies were undisturbed, and rescue equipment showed no signs of hasty deployment. This pattern contradicted every known scenario for mountaineering emergencies, which typically involved some use of safety equipment or emergency signaling devices. The absence of any distress signals or emergency preparations suggested that whatever happened to the team occurred without warning and without time for standard emergency responses. Weather data collected by the camp's automated monitoring systems showed no unusual atmospheric conditions during the period when the team disappeared. Temperature, wind speed, and barometric pressure readings were all within normal ranges for the elevation and season. Satellite imagery reviewed by park rangers showed no evidence of avalanche activity, storm systems, or other environmental factors that might have forced an emergency evacuation of the campsite. The search effort that followed Kendricks' discovery involved multiple helicopter flights and ground teams covering a radius of several miles around the abandoned camp. Experienced rescue personnel used avalanche transceivers, tracking dogs, and thermal imaging equipment to search for any trace of the missing researchers. The terrain around their base camp included crevasse fields, steep ice slopes, and areas prone to avalanche activity, all of which were systematically searched without finding any evidence of the expedition members. Particularly puzzling was the absence of tracks or other signs indicating the direction the team might have traveled when they left their camp. Fresh snow from the previous evening should have preserved footprints, ski tracks, or other evidence of movement away from the base camp area. However, the snow around the camp showed only the tracks made by Kendricks and the initial rescue team members. The pristine condition of the surrounding terrain suggested that no one had moved through the area for at least 24 hours prior to the discovery. The investigation expanded to include analysis of the team's satellite phone records and GPS tracking data from their personal emergency beacons. The last recorded positions showed all 6 team members at their base camp location on the evening of July 5th, with no movement detected after approximately 8:00 p.m. local time. Satellite phone records confirmed that Dr. Chen had attempted to make her scheduled communication at 9:00 p.m., but had been unable to establish a connection due to atmospheric interference, a common problem at high-altitude locations. Electronic data recovery from the team's research equipment revealed normal scientific activities continuing up to the evening of July 5th, with automated instruments recording measurements every 15 minutes as programmed. The data stream showed no anomalous readings that might indicate unusual environmental conditions or equipment malfunctions. Weather instruments recorded calm conditions with moderate temperatures and minimal wind, providing no explanation for an emergency evacuation or hasty departure from the camp. The discovery of the team's expedition vehicle at the mountain's base camp added another layer of mystery to their disappearance. The vehicle was properly secured and showed no signs of hasty departure or emergency use. All keys were accounted for, fuel levels were adequate, and maintenance logs were current. personal items belonging to expedition members remained in the vehicle, including backup clothing, extra food supplies, and emergency equipment that would have been essential for any unplanned departure from the mountain. Family members of the missing researchers provided additional information that deepened the mystery surrounding their disappearance. Dr. Chen had maintained regular communication with her university colleagues via satellite internet until July 5th, discussing normal research activities and expressing satisfaction with the expedition's progress. Her final messages showed no indication of concern about safety issues, equipment problems, or plans to relocate their base camp. Other team members had similarly maintained normal communication patterns with no suggestion of distress or unusual circumstances. The psychological impact on Kendricks and other rescue personnel involved in the search operation proved significant and long-lasting. The scene at the abandoned camp violated fundamental expectations about how people disappear in wilderness environments. Typically, missing person cases involve evidence of struggle, equipment failure, weather emergencies, or other factors that explain the circumstances of disappearance. The complete absence of such evidence, combined with the preserved nature of the camp, created a scenario that challenged basic assumptions about cause and effect in emergency situations. Advanced forensic analysis of the campsite revealed trace evidence that only deepened the mystery. DNA analysis confirmed the presence of all 6 expedition members at various locations throughout the camp, with the most recent samples dating to July 5th based on environmental degradation patterns. Fingerprint analysis on camp equipment showed normal handling patterns, with no evidence of struggle or hasty movement. Food analysis confirmed that the partially prepared meal had been interrupted during cooking, with chemical testing indicating the food had been exposed to heat for approximately 45 minutes before the stoves were abandoned. The case attracted attention from federal investigators due to the high-profile nature of the missing researchers and the unusual circumstances of their disappearance. Dr. Chen's climate research had implications for national policy decisions, and her team included citizens from multiple countries, requiring coordination with international agencies. The investigation expanded to include background checks on all team members, analysis of their research activities, and examination of any potential security concerns related to their scientific work. Theories proposed by investigators ranged from voluntary disappearance to abduction by unknown parties, though none adequately explained the available evidence. The voluntary disappearance theory was undermined by the team members' established personal and professional commitments, their financial situations, and the abandonment of expensive equipment and research data. Abduction scenarios faced the challenge of explaining how 6 experienced mountaineers could be removed from a remote, high-altitude location without leaving any trace evidence or signs of struggle. Alternative theories suggested possible involvement of aircraft or other transportation methods that could have removed the team from their isolated camp location. However, radar records showed no unauthorized aircraft activity in the area during the relevant time period, and the camp's location would have made helicopter access extremely challenging due to altitude and terrain constraints. The logistics required for removing 6 people and their equipment without detection would have required sophisticated planning and execution that seemed unlikely in the remote wilderness setting. The search for the Arctic research expedition continued for 6 weeks, involving hundreds of personnel and representing one of the most extensive rescue operations in Denali's history. Ground teams, helicopter reconnaissance, satellite imagery analysis, and specialized tracking techniques were employed to search an area covering over 100 square miles of challenging mountain terrain. Despite these efforts, no trace of the 6 missing researchers was ever discovered, leaving their fate unknown and their disappearance unexplained. The psychological aftermath of the case affected not only family members of the missing researchers, but also the broader scientific and mountaineering communities that had known and worked with the expedition members. The complete absence of explanation for their disappearance challenged basic assumptions about safety and security in remote research environments. Several planned expeditions were canceled or postponed as researchers reconsidered the risks associated with isolated fieldwork in extreme environments. For Kendricks Powell, the discovery of the empty camp marked a turning point in his career as a rescue pilot, as the unexplained nature of the disappearance created lasting anxiety about similar discoveries in future operations. The pristine condition of the abandoned camp, with its still warm food and undisturbed personal belongings, became a recurring image that haunted his sleep and affected his ability to approach other emergency calls with professional detachment. The case remains active with the National Park Service and federal investigators, though the likelihood of resolution diminishes with each passing year. The Arctic Research Expedition's disappearance has become part of Denali's growing collection of unsolved mysteries, joining other cases of climbers and researchers who have vanished without explanation in the mountain's vast wilderness. The empty camp serves as a reminder that in the world's most remote places, people can disappear as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered. The legacy of the missing expedition continues to influence safety protocols for research activities in remote locations, with new requirements for redundant communication systems, enhanced tracking devices, and more frequent check-in schedules. However, these measures address known risks and conventional emergency scenarios, offering little protection against the unknown forces that claimed Dr. Chen and her team in the pristine wilderness of North America's highest peak. Dalen Williams had been working as a high-altitude rescue specialist for the National Park Service for 9 years when he received the emergency call that would haunt him for the rest of his career. On May 15, 2019, at 3:42 a.m., his satellite phone erupted with the desperate voice of Dr. Marcus Chen, reporting that his entire 5-person geological research team had fallen through a collapsing ice bridge into one of Denali's deepest crevasse systems. What should have been a routine technical rescue would instead become a desperate race against time in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, where every decision carried life or death consequences, and failure meant watching innocent people die in the frozen darkness below. The emergency began when Chen's geological expedition, studying glacial movement patterns and ice formation dynamics at approximately 16,000 feet, encountered what appeared to be a solid snow bridge spanning a narrow crevasse in the Ruth Glacier system. The team had been using established protocols for crevasse crossing, with lead climbers testing the stability of snow bridges using probe poles and weight distribution techniques before committing their full body weight to the crossing. The bridge had appeared completely stable during their initial assessment, showing no signs of weakness or structural compromise that would indicate danger. Dr. Chen's team consisted of 5 highly experienced professionals, each with extensive backgrounds in cold weather research and technical climbing skills. Besides Chen himself, a professor of glaciology at the University of Alaska, the group included Dr. Sarah Martinez, a structural engineer specializing in ice mechanics, James Park, a mountain guide with 15 years of Denali experience, Lisa Thompson, a graduate student in environmental science, and Dr. Eric Johansson, a Swedish physicist studying climate change impacts on glacial systems. Their collective experience represented over 60 years of polar and high-altitude research, making the subsequent tragedy all the more shocking to the scientific and mountaineering communities. The ice bridge that claimed the lives of 4 team members had formed naturally over a crevasse, estimated to be nearly 200 feet deep and approximately 15 feet wide at its narrowest point. Such formations are common in glacial environments, created when wind-blown snow accumulates across crevasse openings and gradually consolidates into structures capable of supporting significant weight. The team's crossing procedure followed established safety protocols, with members spaced at safe intervals and moving one at a time to minimize stress on the bridge structure. Chen, as expedition leader, had crossed first to establish an anchor point on the far side of the crevasse, allowing him to belay his teammates during their individual crossings. The bridge had supported his 200-pound frame without any indication of weakness, and he had established what appeared to be a completely secure position to assist the rest of his team. Park, the most experienced mountain guide, crossed second, followed by Martinez, whose engineering background made her particularly conscious of structural safety factors in the ice bridge evaluation. The catastrophic failure occurred as Thompson, the graduate student, was making her crossing while being belayed by Chen from the far side. Without warning, the entire central section of the ice bridge collapsed, creating a gap approximately 20 feet wide that swallowed Thompson immediately and left Park and Martinez stranded on unstable ice formations that were rapidly disintegrating under their weight. The sound of the collapse, described by Chen as like thunder combined with breaking glass, echoed through the surrounding glacier system and alerted him to the magnitude of the disaster that was unfolding. Chen's desperate radio call to emergency services captured the chaos and terror of watching his colleagues disappear into the crevasse system. His voice, distorted by panic and the technical limitations of high-altitude communication, described hearing screams from below that indicated at least some of his team members had survived the initial fall. However, the instability of the remaining ice formations around the crevasse opening made immediate rescue attempts extremely dangerous, as any additional weight or vibration could trigger further collapses that would claim more lives. Dr. Johansson, who had been waiting to cross when the bridge collapsed, found himself separated from Chen by the newly formed gap and unable to provide direct assistance to the trapped team members. His position on the approach side of the crevasse gave him a different perspective on the disaster, and his subsequent radio transmissions provided crucial information about the extent of the collapse and the condition of the ice formations surrounding the accident site. His observations would prove essential for the rescue teams attempting to understand the technical challenges they would face during their response. Dalen's helicopter arrived at the accident site 47 minutes after Chen's initial emergency call, a response time that represented exceptional performance given the remote location and challenging flight conditions at 16,000 feet elevation. However, even this rapid response left precious time for the survival of anyone who had fallen into the crevasse system, where temperatures below zero and potential injuries from the fall would quickly become life-threatening factors in the rescue equation. The scene that confronted Dalen and his rescue team exceeded their worst-case scenario preparations for crevasse rescue operations. The collapsed ice bridge had created a debris field of unstable ice blocks and snow formations that extended for nearly 50 feet around the original crevasse opening. The gap itself was too wide for conventional bridge-building techniques, and the condition of the surrounding ice made establishing secure anchor points extremely challenging. Most concerning were the continued sounds of ice movement and occasional small collapses that indicated the entire area remained structurally unstable. Initial attempts to establish voice contact with the trapped team members yielded mixed results that both encouraged and terrified the rescue team. Thompson's voice could be heard clearly from approximately 60 feet down in the crevasse, indicating that she had survived the fall and was conscious enough to respond to shouted questions from above. However, her descriptions of her injuries suggested significant trauma, including what appeared to be a broken leg and possible internal injuries from the impact with ice formations during her fall. Martinez's situation was more precarious, as her voice came from a greater depth within the crevasse system and showed signs of severe distress consistent with serious injuries. Her responses to questions were sometimes delayed or confused, suggesting possible head trauma or the effects of hypothermia and shock. Most ominously, Park's voice had been heard briefly during the initial aftermath of the collapse, but had since fallen silent despite repeated attempts to establish communication. The technical challenges facing the rescue team were compounded by the unstable nature of the ice formations surrounding the crevasse opening, which made conventional rappelling techniques extremely dangerous. Each anchor point had to be tested repeatedly to ensure it could support the weight of rescue personnel and equipment, while the continued movement of ice within the crevasse walls created the constant threat of further collapses that could trap rescue workers alongside the original victims. Dalen's first descent into the crevasse revealed a complex three-dimensional maze of ice formations, fallen debris, and narrow passages that made navigation extremely difficult even with specialized equipment and lighting. The temperature within the crevasse was significantly lower than the surface conditions, creating an environment where hypothermia would quickly incapacitate anyone without proper protection. The acoustic properties of the ice walls made it difficult to determine the exact locations of the trapped team members, as voices seemed to echo from multiple directions simultaneously. Thompson was located first, trapped on a narrow ice ledge approximately 70 feet below the original surface level. Her condition was critical but stable, with obvious fractures to her left leg and signs of internal injuries that required immediate medical attention. However, the ledge that had saved her life was itself unstable, showing cracks and movement that indicated it could collapse at any moment. Evacuating her would require extremely careful rigging to avoid triggering a collapse that would send her deeper into the crevasse system. Martinez was found at a greater depth, nearly 100 feet down in a narrow chimney formation that severely limited rescue access. Her injuries were more severe than Thompson's, and her level of consciousness had deteriorated significantly during the time required to locate her position. The confined space made it impossible to provide adequate medical care at her location, requiring immediate evacuation despite the technical challenges posed by the narrow passage and unstable ice conditions. The discovery of Park's body came after nearly 4 hours of searching through the labyrinthine ice formations within the crevasse system. He had fallen deeper than the others, striking multiple ice formations during his descent before coming to rest in a position where rescue was impossible. The location of his body, wedged between ice walls in a passage too narrow for human access, meant that recovery would not be possible until significant changes in the glacial structure occurred naturally over time. The evacuation of Thompson required 6 hours of careful rigging and technical rope work, with rescue team members working in rotating shifts due to the extreme cold and physical demands of the operation. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid triggering further ice collapses, and the evacuation route had to be modified several times as ice conditions changed during the rescue effort. Her extraction was ultimately successful, though her injuries required immediate helicopter evacuation to medical facilities in Anchorage. Martinez's rescue proved even more challenging due to her deeper location and deteriorating condition. By the time rescue personnel reached her position, she had lost consciousness and showed signs of severe hypothermia in addition to her traumatic injuries. The narrow passage that had trapped her required specialized equipment and techniques to create sufficient working space for medical treatment and evacuation rigging. Despite heroic efforts by the rescue team, Martinez died during the evacuation attempt, succumbing to her injuries and exposure before she could be brought to the surface. The investigation into the ice bridge collapse revealed conditions that challenged existing understanding of glacial ice mechanics and bridge stability assessment. Analysis of ice samples from the collapse area showed that internal stress patterns within the glacier had created weakness zones that were not detectable using standard probing techniques. The bridge had appeared completely stable from the surface, with no visible cracks or deformation that would have warned climbers of impending failure. Advanced structural analysis conducted by engineering specialists determined that the ice bridge had been weakened by temperature variations and internal stress patterns that developed over weeks or months before the final collapse. The failure occurred when the accumulated stress exceeded the structural capacity of the ice formation, creating a sudden and catastrophic collapse that provided no warning to the climbers using the bridge. The engineering analysis concluded that the collapse was not predictable using current assessment techniques and represented a type of failure that was virtually impossible to prevent with existing safety protocols. The psychological impact on Chen and Johansen, the two survivors of the expedition, proved devastating and long-lasting. Both men struggled with survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress related to witnessing the deaths of their colleagues and being unable to prevent the tragedy. Chen retired from active field research following the incident, unable to return to the glacial environments that had been his life's work. Johansen experienced similar difficulties, requiring extensive psychological counseling to cope with the trauma of the experience. For Dalen Williams, the crevasse rescue marked a turning point in his career as a mountain rescue specialist, as the technical challenges and tragic outcome of the operation exceeded anything in his previous experience. The combination of extreme environmental conditions, unstable terrain, and critically injured victims created a scenario that tested the limits of rescue capabilities and highlighted the inherent dangers faced by emergency responders in high-altitude environments. The tragedy led to significant revisions in safety protocols for glacier travel and crevasse crossing techniques, with new emphasis on redundant safety systems and enhanced assessment methods for ice bridge stability. Research into predictive techniques for ice bridge failure became a priority for glaciologists and safety specialists, though the complex nature of ice mechanics continues to make absolute prediction impossible. The loss of 3 experienced researchers in the ice bridge collapse served as a sobering reminder of the unpredictable dangers inherent in glacial environments, where even the most experienced professionals remain vulnerable to forces beyond human control or prediction. The incident highlighted the courage and dedication of rescue personnel like Dalen Williams, who risk their own lives to save others in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth, often under circumstances where success is measured not by lives saved, but by the determination to never abandon hope in the face of impossible odds. The families of the victims found some measure of comfort in knowing that their loved ones died pursuing scientific research that would contribute to understanding climate change and glacial dynamics, work that continues to be essential for protecting future generations from environmental challenges. However, the price paid for this knowledge serves as a constant reminder of the risks faced by those who venture into the world's most extreme environments in pursuit of scientific understanding and human knowledge. Jaslyn Carter had earned her reputation as one of the most competent and trusted mountain guides in Alaska, over 8 successful seasons leading expeditions up Denali's challenging routes. Clients consistently praised her technical expertise, safety-first mentality, and ability to make sound decisions under pressure in the mountain's most dangerous conditions. What none of her previous clients or colleagues in the guiding community suspected was that beneath her professional exterior lay a deeply disturbed individual who had been systematically leading expeditions into lethal terrain for reasons that had nothing to do with mountaineering achievement and everything to do with satisfying her psychological need to watch people die. The 2020 climbing season brought Jaslyn her most ambitious and disturbing plan, yet when she was contracted to guide the Morrison family expedition, a group of 5 wealthy clients from Texas seeking to become the first multi-generational family to summit Denali together. The expedition included 62-year-old patriarch Robert Morrison, a successful oil executive, his 34-year-old son Michael, a competitive athlete and experienced rock climber. His daughter Sarah, 28, a physician with limited high-altitude experience, and 2 family friends, James Chen and David Park, both in their 40s with extensive outdoor recreational backgrounds, but no previous mountaineering experience above 14,000 feet. The Morrison family had specifically requested Jaslyn as their guide based on glowing recommendations from previous clients and her perfect safety record over 8 years of professional guiding. They paid premium rates for her services, expecting the kind of expert leadership that would give them the best possible chance of reaching the summit safely, while creating the family legacy that had motivated their ambitious undertaking. What they could not have known was that Jaslyn's perfect safety record was not the result of exceptional skill and judgment, but rather the product of careful planning that had eliminated witnesses to her previous murders. Jaslyn's psychological pathology had developed gradually over her years in the mountains, beginning with a fascination with death and suffering that she initially attributed to the natural morbidity associated with high-risk activities. However, her interest in watching people die had evolved into active manipulation of circumstances to create life-threatening situations while maintaining plausible deniability about her role in the resulting tragedies. She had perfected techniques for creating apparently accidental deaths that would never be investigated as murders, using her expertise and reputation to deflect any suspicion about her involvement. The expedition's route selection provided the first indication of Jaslyn's deadly intentions, though the warning signs were subtle enough to escape detection by clients who trusted her professional judgment completely. Instead of the standard West Buttress route that offered the best combination of achievable challenge and reasonable safety margins for a mixed experience group, Jaslyn recommended the technically demanding Cassin Ridge approach, claiming that the family's athletic backgrounds and determination made them capable of handling the increased difficulty. Her route recommendation was supported by detailed technical arguments about weather windows, crowd avoidance, and the unique achievement value of completing a more challenging ascent. The Morrison family, flattered by her confidence in their abilities and excited about the prospect of a more exclusive mountaineering experience, enthusiastically endorsed her suggestion despite warnings from other guides who questioned the appropriateness of the route selection for their experience levels. The expedition's preparation phase revealed additional aspects of Jaslyn's manipulation techniques, as she systematically undermined her clients' confidence in their own judgment, while positioning herself as their only reliable source of safety information. She convinced the Morrison family to rely exclusively on her equipment recommendations, route planning, and decision-making authority, arguing that conflicting opinions and second-guessing would create dangerous confusion in critical situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Her psychological manipulation extended to isolating the expedition from external communication and support systems that might have provided alternative perspectives on their planning and progress. Jaslyn convinced her clients to minimize their use of satellite communication devices, claiming that excessive external input would compromise their authentic mountaineering experience and create unnecessary distractions from the focus required for safe progression up the mountain. The ascent began on June 8, 2020, with Jaslyn immediately implementing subtle sabotage techniques designed to increase the expedition's risk exposure, while maintaining her facade as a competent professional guide. Her first target was James Chen, whom she identified as the most physically capable member of the group, and therefore the greatest potential threat to her plans. She began by providing him with effective equipment that would function normally under routine conditions, but fail catastrophically under the stress loading that would occur during emergency situations. Chen's climbing harness, selected personally by Jaslyn from her equipment cache, had been weakened through careful application of chemical solvents that degraded the webbing material without creating visible damage. The harness would support normal climbing loads indefinitely, but would fail instantly if subjected to the dynamic forces generated by a significant fall. Jaslyn's technical knowledge allowed her to engineer the sabotage, precisely ensuring failure would occur under specific circumstances that she could control through her route selection and timing. The expedition's first serious technical challenge came on June 12th, during their ascent of the Cassin Ridge's lower ice falls, where complex route finding and secure anchor placement were essential for safe progress. Jaslyn deliberately led the group into a section of unstable ice formations that appeared solid from below, but were actually compromised by recent temperature fluctuations and structural stress. Her plan required Chen to be in the lead position when they reached the most dangerous section of the route. As the team prepared to navigate a particularly challenging ice pitch, Jaslyn positioned Chen at the front of their rope team and encouraged him to push the pace to take advantage of what she claimed were optimal ice conditions that would deteriorate rapidly if they delayed. Her route selection forced Chen to climb through a section where ice formations were held in place only by surface tension and freezing that would fail under the weight and movement of a climber. The ice collapse that followed appeared to be a tragic mountaineering accident of the type that claims experienced climbers regularly in challenging environments. Chen fell approximately 40 feet when the ice formation he was climbing broke away from the underlying rock, sending him tumbling into a crevasse system that would have provided survivable landing areas if his harness had functioned properly. Instead, the sabotaged equipment failed exactly as Jaslyn had planned, allowing Chen to fall uncontrolled to his death at the bottom of the crevasse. Jaslyn's response to Chen's death was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that reinforced her position as the expedition's protector, while deflecting any suspicion about her role in the tragedy. She immediately took charge of the emergency response, demonstrating apparent expertise in rescue techniques while ensuring that her efforts would be unsuccessful. Her emotional display of grief and determination convinced the surviving expedition members that she was devastated by the loss of their teammate and more committed than ever to their safety. The psychological impact of Chen's death on the remaining expedition members created exactly the conditions that Jaslyn needed to implement the next phase of her plan. The survivors were traumatized, frightened, and completely dependent on her leadership for their survival in an environment that had already proven deadly. Their emotional state made them even more susceptible to her manipulation and less likely to question her decisions or recognize warning signs of additional danger. David Park became Jaslyn's next target, selected because his close friendship with Chen had left him emotionally devastated and vulnerable to the kind of psychological manipulation that would convince him to take unnecessary risks. Jaslyn began working on Park's guilt about surviving when his friend had died, suggesting that Chen would want him to continue the expedition and achieve the summit that they had planned to reach together. Her manipulation of Park involved convincing him to take the lead position during technically challenging sections of the climb, arguing that his experience and determination made him the logical choice to break trail for the less experienced family members. What Park did not realize was that Jaslyn was deliberately leading the expedition into avalanche-prone terrain, where his position at the front of their climbing formation would make him the most vulnerable to slides triggered by their passage. The avalanche that killed Park was smaller than the massive slides that typically make headlines in mountaineering disasters, but it was perfectly positioned to achieve Jaslyn's objectives. The slide occurred in a narrow couloir, where the expedition was forced to travel single file with Park in the lead position as Jaslyn had arranged. The avalanche carried him approximately 300 feet down the slope before burying him under several tons of snow and debris. Jaslyn's rescue efforts following Park's burial were professionally executed, but deliberately delayed to ensure that he would suffocate before being recovered. She spent precious minutes organizing equipment and coordinating the search pattern, while claiming to be implementing standard avalanche rescue protocols. By the time Park was located and excavated, he had been buried for nearly 20 minutes, far beyond the survival limits for avalanche burial even under optimal conditions. The loss of 2 expedition members in 3 days created a psychological crisis for the surviving Morrison family members that played perfectly into Jaslyn's long-term planning. Robert Morrison, as the expedition leader and family patriarch, felt responsible for the deaths and was torn between his desire to continue pursuing their goal and his obligation to protect his children from additional risk. His emotional turmoil made him even more dependent on Jaslyn's guidance and less capable of making independent decisions about their safety. Michael Morrison's response to the tragedies was more suspicious and potentially dangerous to Jaslyn's plans. As an experienced athlete with good judgment and risk assessment skills, he began questioning some of her decisions and expressing concerns about continuing the expedition, given their losses and the apparent increase in objective hazards they were encountering. His growing skepticism represented a threat to Jaslyn's control over the group and her ability to implement her final murders. Jaslyn's solution to Michael's growing independence was to engineer a situation where he would be forced to choose between his own safety and his family's welfare, knowing that his protective instincts would drive him to sacrifice himself for his father and sister. She accomplished this by leading the expedition into terrain where they would be trapped by weather and forced to make critical decisions about evacuation priorities during a rescue scenario she had carefully orchestrated. The storm that trapped the expedition at 17,000 feet was real, but not unexpected, as Jaslyn had been monitoring weather patterns and deliberately timing their progress to ensure they would be caught in dangerous conditions at a location where rescue would be extremely difficult. Her plan required the family members to believe that their situation was the result of unpredictable mountain weather, rather than deliberate manipulation of their schedule and route selection. During the rescue operation that followed, Michael Morrison died attempting to secure safety lines for his family's evacuation from their storm-trapped position. His death appeared heroic and necessary, exactly as Jaslyn had planned, but was actually the result of equipment sabotage and route selection that created an unnecessarily dangerous rescue scenario. The climbing anchors that failed during Michael's rescue attempt had been weakened, using the same techniques Jaslyn had employed on Chen's harness. The final phase of Jaslyn's plan involved the murder of Robert Morrison during their descent from the mountain, when psychological trauma and physical exhaustion would make him most vulnerable to the kind of accident she specialized in engineering. However, Sarah Morrison's medical training and observational skills had made her increasingly suspicious of the pattern of equipment failures and route selection decisions that had characterized their expedition. Sarah's growing suspicions culminated in her discovery of Jaslyn's equipment modification tools and chemical supplies, hidden in her guide pack alongside documentation of her previous murders, disguised as expedition planning materials. The confrontation that followed revealed Jaslyn's complete psychological break from reality and her grandiose delusions about her role as an agent of natural selection who was improving the human species by eliminating the weak and unworthy. The final confrontation between Sarah Morrison and Jaslyn Carter took place at 14,000 feet during their descent, when Sarah attempted to prevent the murder of her father by exposing Jaslyn's true nature and calling for emergency evacuation. Jaslyn's response was to attempt the immediate murder of both remaining expedition members, abandoning her careful planning in favor of direct violence that would eliminate witnesses to her crimes. Sarah's survival and eventual rescue were due to her medical knowledge of hypothermia treatment and her ability to use Jaslyn's own equipment against her during their life or death struggle. The physical confrontation resulted in Jaslyn's death when she fell into the same type of crevasse system she had used to murder her previous victims, providing a form of Poetic justice that would have appealed to her twisted sense of natural selection. The investigation that followed Sarah's rescue revealed the full scope of Jaslyn's murder spree and her sophisticated methods for disguising homicides as mountaineering accidents. Forensic analysis of equipment found at various locations throughout the Alaska Range confirmed that she had been responsible for at least 12 deaths over her 8-year guiding career, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, despite operating in a profession dedicated to preserving life and safety. The discovery of Jaslyn's crimes sent shockwaves through the mountaineering community and led to significant changes in guide certification, background screening, and oversight procedures for professional mountaineering services. Her ability to operate undetected for so many years highlighted dangerous gaps in the systems designed to protect clients who entrust their lives to professional guides in high-risk environments. For Sarah Morrison, survival came at the cost of losing her entire expedition team and discovering that their trusted guide had been systematically murdering clients for years while maintaining a facade of professional competence and caring. Her experience led to the development of new safety protocols and client education programs designed to help future mountaineers recognize warning signs of potentially dangerous guide behavior. The legacy of Jaslyn Carter's crimes continues to influence mountaineering safety practices and serves as a reminder that in remote wilderness environments, the greatest danger may come from the very people clients trust to protect them. Her case proved that even the most trusted professionals can harbor deadly secrets that turn mountain adventures into carefully orchestrated murder scenarios, where clients become victims of predators who use their expertise and reputation to hunt human prey in the world's most beautiful and isolated places. Taylon Rogers had been working as a forensic investigator for the Alaska State Troopers for 12 years when she received the assignment that would challenge everything she thought she understood about death, time, and the preservation of evidence in extreme environments. On August 3, 2023, climbers on Denali's Muldrow Glacier discovered what appeared to be a perfectly preserved base camp from a previous era, complete with vintage equipment, personal belongings, and the frozen remains of 3 expedition members who had been missing for over 4 decades. The discovery would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Alaskan criminal history, revealing a story of betrayal, murder, and survival that had been literally frozen in time. The initial discovery was made by members of the Arctic Heritage Expedition, a group of experienced mountaineers attempting to retrace historical climbing routes on Denali's less-traveled north side. Team leader David Chen reported finding what appeared to be an abandoned campsite with equipment and supplies that looked decades out of date, preserved in pristine condition by the extreme cold and dry conditions at approximately 12,000 feet elevation. The level of preservation was extraordinary, with fabric, paper, and even organic materials showing minimal deterioration despite obvious exposure to the elements. When Chen's team approached the camp for closer inspection, they made the shocking discovery of 3 human bodies positioned around what appeared to be the remains of a camp stove, frozen in positions that suggested they had died while attempting to prepare food or stay warm. The bodies were so perfectly preserved that they appeared to have died recently, with clothing, facial features, and even expressions clearly visible beneath a thin layer of frost. However, the style of their equipment and clothing suggested they had been there for much longer than their appearance indicated. The Alaska State Troopers dispatched Taylon to investigate the discovery due to her expertise in cold weather forensics and her experience with historical missing person cases. Her initial assessment of the scene revealed a level of preservation that exceeded anything in her professional experience, with the frozen environment creating conditions that had essentially stopped the decay process completely. The bodies showed no signs of scavenging by animals or significant weathering, appearing almost lifelike despite having been exposed to the elements for an unknown period. Documentation found at the campsite identified the deceased as members of the 1981 Peterson Geological Survey Expedition, a privately funded research team that had disappeared during an attempt to conduct mineral surveys on Denali's remote northern approaches. The expedition had been reported missing in September 1981 when they failed to return from their scheduled 3-week survey mission, but extensive search efforts had been unsuccessful due to early winter weather that made access to their intended research areas impossible. The 3 bodies were identified through personal effects and documentation as Dr. Harold Peterson, the expedition leader and a respected geologist from the University of Alaska, James Morrison, a graduate student in geology, and Sarah Chen, a cartographer and experienced mountaineer who had been hired to assist with navigation and camp management. The 4th member of the original expedition, Robert Hayes, was not found at the campsite, leading to immediate questions about his fate and the circumstances that had led to the deaths of his 3 companions. Talen's forensic examination of the bodies revealed evidence of violent trauma that was inconsistent with deaths from exposure, altitude sickness, or other natural causes typically associated with mountaineering fatalities. Peterson showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, with fracture patterns that suggested repeated impacts from a heavy object. Morrison's body displayed defensive wounds on his hands and arms, indicating he had struggled against an attacker before succumbing to what appeared to be stab wounds to his chest and abdomen. Most disturbing was the condition of Chen's body, which showed evidence of restraint marks on her wrists and ankles, suggesting she had been tied up before her death. Her injuries were concentrated on her face and upper body, with trauma patterns that indicated prolonged torture rather than a quick death during a struggle. The positioning of her body, separate from the 2 male victims and arranged in what appeared to be a deliberately degrading manner, suggested that her killer had taken particular pleasure in her suffering. The campsite itself provided additional evidence that contradicted any natural explanation for the expedition's fate. Equipment and supplies were scattered in patterns consistent with a violent struggle, with personal belongings thrown about and valuable items missing despite the remote location where theft would seem unlikely. Most significantly, the camp's food supplies had been systematically destroyed or contaminated, suggesting deliberate sabotage rather than accidental spoilage or animal interference. Analysis of the expedition's journal entries, recovered from Peterson's personal effects and preserved in readable condition by the extreme cold, revealed a progressive deterioration in group dynamics during the weeks leading up to their deaths. Early entries described normal research activities and camp routines, but later entries by different expedition members documented growing tensions between Hayes and the rest of the team over leadership decisions, resource allocation, and expedition objectives. Peterson's final journal entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described disturbing changes in Hayes's behavior that included paranoid accusations against his teammates, hoarding of food and equipment, and violent outbursts that made other expedition members fear for their safety. The final entry, dated September 12, 1981, described Peterson's plan to confront Hayes about his behavior and demand that the expedition return to base camp immediately due to safety concerns about Hayes's mental state. Morrison's journal provided a different perspective on the deteriorating situation, with entries that described Hayes's growing obsession with the expedition's mineral survey findings and his claims that the other team members were planning to steal his discoveries for their own financial gain. Morrison's final entries expressed genuine fear of Hayes and described attempts to establish emergency communication with outside authorities, though their remote location made radio contact impossible with the limited equipment available in 1981. Chen's cartographic notes, recorded in precise technical language despite the obviously stressful circumstances, documented Hayes's increasingly erratic route selections and his insistence on establishing camps in locations that were tactically disadvantageous for safety, but would provide concealment from potential rescue efforts. Her final map annotations showed their position at the time of the murders and included coded notations that appeared to be attempts to leave evidence for future discovery. The investigation into Hayes's background revealed a history of psychological instability and previous incidents of violence that had been concealed from other expedition members during the planning phases of their research project. Military records showed that Hayes had been discharged from the Army under circumstances involving assault charges that were dropped due to technicalities, and previous employers described patterns of paranoid behavior and conflicts with colleagues that had resulted in his dismissal from multiple positions. Financial records from 1981 revealed that Hayes was facing significant personal debt and legal problems that gave him strong motivation to view the expedition's geological findings as his exclusive property worth killing to protect. The mineral survey data recovered from the campsite documented significant gold deposits in previously unexplored areas of Denali, information that would have been extremely valuable to mining interests if properly developed and legally claimed. The forensic timeline constructed from journal entries, weather records, and evidence at the campsite indicated that the murders occurred over a period of several days, with Hayes systematically killing his teammates while maintaining the appearance of normal camp activities. Peterson appears to have been killed first during the confrontation he had planned, followed by Morrison when he attempted to help his expedition leader. Chen survived longest, possibly several days, during which time Hayes appears to have tortured her for information about the expedition's research findings and communication procedures. Hayes's ultimate fate remained a mystery until Talen's investigation expanded to include aerial searches of the surrounding glacier system, using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment. His body was eventually located in a crevasse approximately 2 miles from the murder camp, where he had apparently fallen while attempting to descend from the mountain carrying stolen expedition equipment and research materials. The condition of his remains suggested he had survived the fall initially, but had died from exposure after being trapped in the crevasse for an extended period. The psychological profile developed for Hayes during the investigation painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose mental illness had been exacerbated by the isolation and stress of the expedition environment. Forensic psychologists determined that he had likely been planning the murders for weeks before carrying them out, using his knowledge of the team's research schedule and communication limitations to ensure that his crimes would not be discovered until long after he had escaped with the valuable geological data. The recovery and investigation of the frozen expedition created significant legal complications due to the unusual circumstances of evidence preservation and the decades-long delay between the crimes and their discovery. While Hayes's death made criminal prosecution impossible, the investigation provided closure for the families of his victims and contributed valuable information to research on psychological factors in extreme environment expeditions. The extraordinary preservation of the crime scene also provided unique opportunities for forensic science education and research, with the frozen camp serving as a case study for evidence preservation techniques and cold weather investigation procedures. The level of detail available from the preserved scene exceeded anything previously documented in forensic literature, while offering unprecedented insights into the progression of a violent crime over an extended period. For Talen Rogers, the investigation represented both the most challenging and most rewarding case of her career, combining elements of historical research, forensic analysis, and psychological profiling in ways that pushed the boundaries of traditional investigative techniques. The emotional impact of confronting perfectly preserved evidence of torture and murder, combined with the decades-long suffering of victim families who had never known the fate of their loved ones, created psychological challenges that required extensive counseling and peer support. The discovery also highlighted the vulnerability of expedition members to violence from within their own teams, particularly in remote environments where traditional law enforcement response is impossible, and victims have no means of escape from dangerous situations. The case led to enhanced background screening procedures for expedition participants and the development of emergency communication protocols designed to detect and prevent similar crimes in isolated wilderness settings. The families of Peterson, Morrison, and Chen found some measure of peace in finally learning the truth about their loved one's fate, though the brutal nature of their deaths and the decades of uncertainty that preceded the discovery created lasting trauma that required ongoing psychological support. The recovery of personal effects and the ability to provide proper burial for the victims offered some comfort, but could never fully compensate for the years of not knowing whether their family members were alive or dead. The frozen time capsule of the 1981 murders serves as a stark reminder that evil can be preserved just as effectively as evidence in the extreme conditions found on the world's highest peaks. The perfect preservation that saved every detail of Hayes's crimes for future discovery also meant that the horror experienced by his victims was captured in perpetuity, creating a monument to human cruelty in one of Earth's most pristine and beautiful environments. The case remains a landmark in forensic science and criminal investigation, demonstrating both the potential for evidence preservation in extreme environments and the psychological challenges faced by investigators who must confront perfectly preserved scenes of violence and suffering. For future expeditions venturing into Denali's remote areas, the discovery serves as a warning that the mountain's ability to preserve the past extends to humanity's darkest moments, as well as its greatest achievements. The legacy of the frozen expedition continues to influence mountaineering safety protocols and serves as a sobering reminder that in the world's most isolated places, the greatest dangers may come not from environmental hazards, but from the darkness that humans can carry within themselves. The mountain's eternal ice had kept Hayes's secrets for over 4 decades, but ultimately could not prevent the truth from emerging to provide justice for his victims and closure for those who loved them. Jalen Matthews had spent 12 years as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service in Alaska when she volunteered to join the 2021 Denali Climate Research Expedition as their weather forecasting specialist and atmospheric data analyst. Her expertise in high-altitude weather patterns and extreme condition prediction had made her an invaluable asset to previous mountaineering expeditions, where accurate weather forecasting often meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. What none of her 5 teammates could have predicted was that her scientific knowledge would become both their greatest hope for survival and the instrument of their ultimate doom when an unprecedented storm system trapped them at Denali's summit for 7 days, forcing impossible choices that would haunt the sole survivor for the rest of her life. The climate research expedition had been organized by the Arctic Studies Institute to collect long-term atmospheric data from Denali's summit region, where extreme altitude and harsh conditions created unique opportunities to study weather patterns that affected the entire North American continent. The 6-member team included some of the world's most experienced high-altitude researchers, with collective expertise spanning meteorology, glaciology, and extreme environment physiology. Jalen's role was to provide real-time weather analysis and forecasting that would keep the team safe, while maximizing their data collection opportunities during the brief weather windows that made summit work possible. The team's composition reflected the expedition's dual scientific and survival requirements. Besides Jalen, the group included Dr. Robert Chen, a high-altitude physiologist who had conducted research on 5 previous Himalayan expeditions, Sarah Martinez, a glaciologist specializing in ice core analysis, Dr. Eric Johansson, an atmospheric physicist studying climate change impacts; James Park, a professional mountain guide with extensive Denali experience; and Lisa Thompson, a graduate student in environmental science whose dissertation research depended on the data they would collect at extreme altitude. The expedition's planned timeline called for a rapid ascent to establish a temporary research station at 19,500 feet, just below Denali summit, where they would conduct intensive data collection for 48 hours before descending during a predicted weather window. Jalen's weather analysis had identified a narrow opportunity between major storm systems that would provide the stable conditions necessary for their high-altitude research work. However, her forecasting models had not accounted for the unprecedented atmospheric dynamics that would develop once they reached the summit region. The team reached their planned research elevation on June 18, 2021, making excellent time despite carrying the heavy scientific equipment required for their data collection objectives. Initial weather conditions were ideal, with clear skies, minimal wind, and temperatures of -10 degrees Fahrenheit that were considered mild for the elevation in season. Jalen's real-time atmospheric readings confirmed her pre-expedition forecasts, and the team began setting up their research equipment with confidence that they would have adequate time to complete their work before conditions deteriorated. The first indication that something was wrong with Jalen's weather predictions came during the evening of June 18th, when barometric pressure readings began fluctuating in patterns that defied her meteorological models and experience. Instead of the stable, high-pressure system her forecast had predicted, atmospheric conditions were showing signs of rapid instability that suggested the development of a major storm system directly over the summit region. Her emergency weather analysis revealed the formation of a previously unknown meteorological phenomenon that was creating conditions unlike anything in recorded weather history. The storm that enveloped the team on June 19th was later classified by the National Weather Service as a unique atmospheric event that combined elements of Arctic cyclones, orographic effects, and high-altitude wind patterns in ways that created a self-sustaining weather system centered directly over Denali summit. Wind speeds reached sustained velocities of over 150 miles per hour, while temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors that approached -100 degrees. Visibility dropped to zero due to blowing snow and ice crystals that made movement beyond their immediate shelter area impossible. The team's survival shelter, a specialized high-altitude tent designed for extreme conditions, became their prison as the storm raged around them with an intensity that made evacuation impossible. Helicopter rescue was completely out of the question due to the wind speeds and visibility conditions, while descent on foot would have been suicidal in the whiteout conditions and hurricane-force winds. Jalen's meteorological analysis of the storm's development patterns indicated that the weather system was likely to persist for at least 5 days, far longer than their food and fuel supplies would last. The psychological impact of being trapped at nearly 20,000 feet in conditions that represented the limits of human survival began to affect team members within the first 24 hours of the storm. The combination of extreme cold, oxygen deprivation, and the stress of their desperate situation created an environment where rational decision-making became increasingly difficult. Dr. Chen, despite his expertise in high-altitude physiology, began showing signs of cerebral edema that compromised his judgment and ability to contribute to their survival planning. By the third day of the storm, food rationing had reduced each team member to consuming fewer than 800 calories per day, far below the energy requirements for survival in extreme cold conditions. Fuel for their stoves was being conserved for critical heating and snow melting, but even strict rationing would not extend their supplies beyond the 5th day. Jalen's weather analysis continued to show no signs of the storm abating, and Her calculations indicated that they faced the choice of attempting a suicidal descent in impossible conditions or remaining in their shelter until their supplies were exhausted. The first death occurred on the fourth day when Dr. Chen succumbed to high-altitude cerebral edema during the night, dying quietly in his sleeping bag, while his teammates tried unsuccessfully to treat his condition with their limited medical supplies. His death created a horrible dilemma for the survivors, as his body would freeze solid within hours and become impossible to move from their cramped shelter. The psychological trauma of sharing their survival space with Chen's corpse added another layer of stress to their already desperate situation. Sarah Martinez's condition deteriorated rapidly on the fifth day as hypothermia began to overwhelm her body's ability to maintain core temperature despite their conservation efforts. Her speech became slurred and confused, and she began making irrational decisions that threatened the survival of the remaining team members. When she attempted to leave the shelter during the height of the storm, claiming she could find help, James Park was forced to physically restrain her to prevent her certain death in the blizzard conditions outside. The most horrific decision faced by the survivors came on the sixth day when their food supplies were completely exhausted, and Martinez had died during the night from hypothermia and exhaustion. With the storm showing no signs of ending and rescue impossible, the surviving 4 team members confronted the unthinkable reality that cannibalism might be their only chance of survival. The decision process that followed revealed the depths of human desperation and the moral compromises that extreme circumstances can force upon otherwise civilized people. Dr. Johansson, whose physical condition was the weakest among the survivors, volunteered to sacrifice himself to provide sustenance for his teammates, arguing that his death was inevitable and that his decision could give the others a chance to survive until rescue became possible. His selfless offer created an agonizing moral dilemma for the team, as accepting his sacrifice would mean actively participating in his death, while refusing might condemn all of them to starvation. The debate that followed would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The psychological breakdown that occurred among the team members during their final discussions about survival options revealed the complete disintegration of normal human behavior under extreme stress. Park argued that they should draw lots to determine who would sacrifice themselves, while Thompson advocated for fighting to the death to avoid the moral corruption of deliberate murder. Jalen found herself in the impossible position of using her meteorological expertise to argue that the storm would end soon, despite her analysis showing no signs of improvement. The storm finally began to abate on the morning of the 7th day, just hours after Dr. Johansson had died peacefully in his sleep, sparing his teammates from having to make the final decision about his proposed sacrifice. The improving weather conditions allowed helicopter rescue operations to begin, but the delay meant that only 3 of the original 6 expedition members would survive their ordeal. Park and Thompson both required immediate medical evacuation for severe hypothermia and frostbite, while Jaylin remained conscious and coherent despite her own serious cold injuries. The investigation into the unprecedented storm that had trapped the climate research expedition revealed meteorological conditions that challenged existing understanding of high-altitude weather patterns and storm formation. The atmospheric dynamics that had created the week-long summit storm involved the interaction of multiple weather systems in ways that had never been previously documented. Climate scientists determined that the storm represented a new type of extreme weather event that might become more common as global climate patterns continue to change. The psychological aftermath of the summit ordeal proved more challenging than the physical recovery for the 3 survivors. Park required extensive counseling to cope with survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress related to their discussions about cannibalism and sacrifice. Thompson struggled with nightmares and anxiety attacks triggered by cold temperatures or confined spaces that reminded her of their trapped situation. The experience fundamentally changed their relationship with mountain environments that had previously been sources of joy and professional satisfaction. For Jalen Matthews, the summit storm represented both the failure of her scientific expertise and a profound lesson about the limitations of human knowledge in confronting nature's most extreme manifestations. Her inability to predict the unprecedented storm that had trapped her team challenged her professional confidence and contributed to her decision to retire from active weather forecasting work. The guilt of leading her colleagues into a situation that cost 3 lives proved more devastating than any physical injuries she had sustained. The scientific data collected by the expedition before the storm struck provided valuable insights into high-altitude atmospheric conditions, but the price paid for this knowledge served as a sobering reminder of the risks involved in extreme environment research. The temperature and pressure readings recorded during the storm created a unique data set that contributed to improved understanding of extreme weather patterns, though the human cost of obtaining this information raised ethical questions about the value of scientific knowledge versus human life. The loss of 3 experienced researchers in the summit storm became part of Denali's growing statistics of climbing fatalities, adding to the mountain's reputation as one of the world's most dangerous peaks for both recreational climbers and scientific researchers. The incident highlighted the vulnerability of even the most experienced and well-equipped teams to weather conditions that exceed all previous understanding and preparation. The mountain's ability to create its own weather systems continues to challenge meteorological prediction and human survival capabilities. The families of Chen, Martinez, and Johansson found some comfort in knowing that their loved ones had died while conducting research that would contribute to scientific understanding of climate change and extreme weather patterns. However, the circumstances of their deaths, trapped in impossible conditions while facing choices that challenged basic human morality, created lasting trauma that required extensive psychological support. The expedition's legacy serves as both a tribute to scientific dedication and a warning about the ultimate price that extreme environment research can demand. The Denali summit storm of 2021 remains one of the most documented extreme weather events in mountaineering history, with the survivors' accounts providing unprecedented insights into human behavior under ultimate stress conditions. The meteorological data collected during the storm contributed to the development of new forecasting models and emergency response protocols for extreme weather situations. However, the human cost of this knowledge serves as a permanent reminder that in the world's most extreme environments, even the most advanced scientific understanding may prove inadequate when confronted with nature's most violent and unpredictable moods.